Live and Let Die by Ian Fleming. From the moment the Boeing taxied up to the British Airways terminal at Kennedy Airport, James Bond was treated like royalty. He had followed the other passengers towards the door marked U.S. Health Service, and a pleasant-looking, nondescript man in plain clothes had stepped forward from the shadow of the building. "Mr. Bond? Oh, my name's Halloran. Pleased to meet you. Hope you had a pleasant trip. Would you follow me, please?" Directly outside, a black Buick waited, its engine sighing quietly. They climbed in. Bond's two light suitcases were in front next to the driver. Bond couldn't imagine how they'd been extracted so quickly from the mound of passengers' luggage he'd seen only minutes before being trolleyed over to customs. He sank back luxuriously as the big limousine surged forward. "Well, that's certainly one of the reddest carpets I've ever seen," he said. "I expected to be at least an hour getting through immigration." "Oh, you're very welcome, Mr. Bond. We want to make your stay comfortable. Anything you want, just say so, and it's yours. You've got some good friends in Washington. Now, it's my job to see you get to your hotel as quickly and as comfortably as possible, then I'll hand you over and be on my way." The driver chose the Triborough Bridge, and they soared across the breathtaking span into the heart of uptown Manhattan, the beautiful prospect of New York hastening towards them, until they were down amongst the hooting, teeming, petrol-smelling roots of the stressed concrete jungle. They drew up at the best hotel in New York, the St. Regis, at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 55th Street. A saturnine, middle-aged man in a blue overcoat and black Homburg came forward behind the commissionaire. On the sidewalk, Halloran introduced him. "Mr. Bond, meet Captain Dexter. Can I pass him along to you now, Captain?" Sure. Just have his bag sent up. Room 2100, top floor. I'll go ahead with Mr. Bond and see he has everything he wants." Bond turned to say goodbye to Halloran and thank him. For a moment, Halloran had his back to him as he said something about Bond's luggage to the commissionaire. Bond looked past him across 55th Street. His eyes narrowed. A black sedan, a Chevrolet, was pulling sharply out into the thick traffic, right in front of a cab that braked hard, its driver banging his fist down on the horn. The sedan kept going, just caught the tail of the green light, and disappeared north up Fifth Avenue. It was a smart, decisive bit of driving. But what startled Bond was that it had been a negress at the wheel, a fine-looking negress in a black chauffeur's uniform, and through the rear window he'd caught a glimpse of the single passenger, a huge, grey-black face, which had turned slowly towards him and looked directly back at him as the car accelerated towards the avenue. Bond shook Halloran by the hand. Dexter touched his elbow impatiently. "We'll go straight in and through the lobby to the elevators, halfway across the lobby, and would you please keep your hat on, Mr. Bond?" As Bond followed Dexter up the steps into the hotel, he reflected that it was almost certainly too late for these precautions. That giant shape in the back seat, that grey-black face. There was only one man who fitted that description. Dexter unlocked the door of number 2100 and shut it behind them. They were in a small, lighted lobby. They left their hats and coats on a chair, and Dexter opened the door in front of them and held it for Bond to go through. He walked into an attractive sitting room decorated in Third Avenue Empire. The central heating was just bearable. The communicating door with his bedroom opened. A tall, thin young man came forward with a wide grin, his hand outstretched to where Bond stood rooted with astonishment. "Felix Leiter, what the hell are you doing here?" Bond grasped the hard hand and shook it warmly. "Don't tell me they put you on this job." "Well, that's exactly what they have done. CIA thought we did all right together in the casino job, so they hauled me away from the Joint Intelligence chaps in Paris, put me through the works in Washington, and here I am. I'm sort of liaison between the Central Intelligence Agency and our friends in the FBI. It's their case, of course, at least the American end of it is. But as you know, there are some big overseas angles, which is CIA's territory, so we're running it joint. Now, you're here to handle the Jamaican end for the British, and the team's complete. Now sit down, let's have a drink. I ordered lunch directly I got the word you were downstairs. It'll be on its way." He went over to the sideboard and started mixing a martini. "Well, I'm damned," said Bond. "Of course, that old Devil M never told me. He just gives one the facts, never the good news." Bond suddenly felt the silence of Captain Dexter. He turned to him. I shall be very glad to be under your orders here, Captain, he said tactfully. As I understand it, the case breaks pretty neatly into two parts. The first half lies wholly on American territory, your jurisdiction, of course. Then it looks as if we shall have to follow it into the Caribbean, Jamaica, and I understand I'm to take over outside United States territorial waters. Felix here will marry up the two halves so far as your government is concerned. Is that how you see it? Dexter smiled thinly. That's just about it, Mr. Bond. Mr. Hoover instructs me to say that he's very pleased to have you along, as our guest, he added. And now perhaps you'd tell us what you know about this case. Bond slit open a packet of king-size Chesterfields, and as he settled back in his comfortable chair in the warm, luxurious room, his mind went back 2 weeks to the bitter, raw day in early January, when he'd been summoned to the office of M, the remarkable man who was then, and still is, head of the Secret Service. Morning, 007. Sit down. Bond walked round to the single chair which faced M across the desk. The grey eyes looked at him intently. Had a good rest? Yes, thank you, sir. Ever seen one of these? M abruptly fished something out of his waistcoat pocket. He tossed it halfway across the desk towards Bond. It fell with a faint clang on the red leather, and lay, gleaming richly, an inch-wide, hammered gold coin. Bond picked it up, turned it over, weighed it in his hand. No, sir. That's a rose noble of Edward IV. M fished again in his pocket and tossed more magnificent gold coins onto the table in front of Bond. As he did so, he glanced at each one and identified it. Double Excelente, Spanish, Ferdinand and Isabella, 1510. Écu au Soleil, French, Charles IX, 1574. Double Écu d'Or, French, Henry IV, 1600. Double Ducat, Spanish, Philip II, 1560. Worth a lot of money melted down, and much, much more to collectors. Notice anything common to them all? Bond reflected. No, sir. All minted before 1650. Captain Morgan, the pirate, was governor and commander-in-chief of Jamaica from 1675 to 1688. The English coin is the joker in the pack, probably shipped out to pay the Jamaican garrison. M paused to light his pipe. But for that, and the dates, these could have come from any other treasure trove put together by the great pirates. As it is, and both Spinks and the British Museum agree, this is almost certainly part of Captain Morgan's treasure. And the hell of a treasure it must be. So far, nearly 1,000 of these and similar coins have turned up in the United States in the last few months. And if the Special Branch of the Treasury and the FBI have traced 1,000, how many more have been melted down or disappeared into private collections? And they keep on coming in, turning up in banks, bullion merchants, curio shops, and pawnbrokers. Someone is using the Negroes, porters, sleeping car attendants, truck drivers, and getting their money well spread over the states. They're quite innocent people. Several times the FBI have caught up with the next link, the middleman who bought them a bit cheaper, and they find that he bought a handful, in one case 100 of them, from some man who presumably got them cheaper still. All these larger transactions have taken place in Harlem or Florida. Always the next man in the link was an unknown Negro, in all cases a white-collar man, prosperous and educated. Good Lord, said Bond. And where do we come into it, sir? I know where the treasure is, said M. At least I'm pretty sure I do. It's in Jamaica, and it is Captain Morgan's, and it's one of the most valuable treasure troves in history. For some time now, we've had our eye on a diesel yacht, the Secreteur, which has been running from a small island on the north coast of Jamaica into the Gulf of Mexico to a place called St. Petersburg. Do you know it? No, sir. Well, it's a sort of pleasure resort near Tampa, west coast of Florida. With the help of the FBI, we've traced the ownership of this boat and of the island to a man called Mr. Big, Negro gangster, lives in Harlem. And curiously enough, a $20 bill, which one of these casual Negroes had paid for a gold coin, and whose number he'd noted for Peek-a-Pow, the numbers game, was paid out by one of Mr. Big's lieutenants, and it was paid, for information received, to an FBI double agent who is a member of the Communist Party. Bond whistled softly. In short, continued M, we suspect that this Jamaican treasure is being used to finance the Soviet espionage system in America, and our suspicion becomes a certainty when I tell you who this Mr. Big is. He's probably the most powerful Negro criminal in the world. He's the head of the Black Widow voodoo cult. He's also a Soviet agent. And finally, he is, and this will particularly interest you, Bond, a known member of SMERSH. I see, said Bond thoughtfully. Quite a case, said M, looking at him keenly. And quite a man, this Mr. Big. He's not pure Negro, born in Haiti, good dose of French blood, trained in Moscow. I'd like to meet him, said Bond. Then he added mildly, I'd like to meet any member of SMERSH. Thought you would, said M. Be ready to start in a week. It's a joint CIA and FBI job. For God's sake, don't step on the FBI's toes. Good luck. And now it was 10 days later, and the talk with Dexter and Leiter had not added much, reflected Bond, as he woke slowly and luxuriously in his bedroom at the St. Regis. Dexter had had plenty of detail on Mr. Big. He was 45 years old, born in Haiti, half Negro and half French. Because of the initial letters of his fanciful name, Bonaparte Ignace Gallia, and because of his huge size, he came to be called, even as a youth, Mr. Big. He had no known vices except women, whom he consumed in quantities. He didn't drink or smoke, and his only Achilles heel appeared to be a chronic heart disease which had, in recent years, imparted a greyish tinge to his skin. Mr. Big had been initiated into voodoo as a child, earned his living as a truck driver in Port-au-Prince before emigrating to America, where he'd worked successfully for a hijacking team in the Legs Diamond Gang. With the end of Prohibition, he had moved to Harlem and bought half shares in a small nightclub and a string of colored call girls. He was called up in 1943, and because of his excellent French, came to the notice of the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime Secret Service of America. They had trained him with great thoroughness, and put him into Marseille as an agent against the Pétain collaborationists. He merged easily with African Negro dockhands and worked well, providing good and accurate naval intelligence. He operated closely with a Soviet spy who was doing a similar job for the Russians. At the end of the war, he disappeared for 5 years, probably to Moscow. He returned to Harlem in 1950, and soon came to the notice of the FBI as a suspected Soviet agent. But he never incriminated himself or fell into any of the traps laid by the FBI. He bought up 3 nightclubs and a prosperous chain of Harlem brothels. He seemed to have unlimited funds, and paid all his lieutenants a flat rate of $20,000 a year. He was known to have originated an underground voodoo temple in Harlem, and to have established a link between it and the main cult in Haiti. He commanded real fear, strongly substantiated by the immediate and often mysterious deaths of anyone who crossed him or disobeyed his orders. In 1951, by the promise of $1 million in gold and a safe refuge after 6 months' work for them, the FBI had at last persuaded a known Soviet agent of the MWD to turn double. All went well for a month, and the results exceeded the highest expectations. The Russian spy held the appointment of an economic expert on the Soviet delegation to the United Nations. One Saturday, he'd gone to take the subway to Pennsylvania Station en route for the Soviet weekend rest camp at Glen Cove. A huge Negro, positively identified from photographs as Mr. Big, had stood beside him on the platform as the train came in, and was seen walking towards the exit even before the first coach had come to a standstill over the bloody vestiges of the Russian. He had not been seen to push the man, but in the crowd it wouldn't have been difficult. Mr. Big, of course, had had an alibi as solid as Fort Knox. He'd been held and questioned, but was quickly sprung by the best lawyer in Harlem. The evidence was good enough for Bond. He was just the man for Smersh, with just the training. A real hard weapon of fear and death. And what a brilliant setup for dealing with the smaller fry of the Negro underworld, and for keeping a colored information network well up to the mark. The fear of voodoo and the supernatural, still deeply, primevally ingrained in the Negro subconscious. Not for the first time, Bond felt his spine crawl at the cold, brilliant efficiency of the Soviet machine, and at the fear of death and torture which made it work, and of which the supreme engine was Smersh. Smersh, the very whisper of death. After breakfast, Bond took his hat and coat and spent the morning on Fifth Avenue and Broadway, wandering aimlessly, gazing into the shop windows and watching the passing crowds. Then he took a cab downtown to police headquarters, where he was due to meet Leiter and Dexter at 2:30. A Lieutenant Binswanger of Homicide told them that the commissioner had said that they were to have complete cooperation from the police department. They examined Mr. Biggs' police record, which more or less duplicated Dexter's information, and they were shown the records and photographs of most of his known associates. They went over the reports of the U.S. Coast Guard Service on the comings and goings of the yacht Secretary. These confirmed that the yacht had put in at irregular intervals over the previous 6 months at St. Petersburg, and that she always tied up at the wharf of the Ouroboros Worm and Bait Shippers Incorporated, an apparently innocent concern whose main business was to sell live bait to fishing clubs throughout Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. The company also had a profitable sideline in seashells and coral for interior decoration, and a further sideline in tropical aquarium fish, particularly rare, poisonous species for the research departments of medical foundations. According to the proprietor, a man known locally as the Robber, Bond and Leiter had exchanged glances when they heard the name, the Secretary did big business with his company, bringing in cargoes of queen conches and other shells from Jamaica, and also highly prized varieties of tropical fish. These were purchased by Ouroboros Incorporated, stored in their warehouse, and sold in bulk to wholesalers and retailers up and down the coast. On the sidewalk outside police headquarters, Bond said, "If Leiter's interested, and if you don't mind, Captain, I'd very much like to get up to Harlem this evening and have a look around. Might help to have some idea what it looks like in Mr. Biggs' backyard." Dexter reflected. "Well, okay," he said finally. "Probably no harm, but don't show yourselves too much and don't get hurt. There's no one to help you up there, and don't go stirring up a lot of trouble for us. This case isn't ripe yet. Until it is, our policy with Mr. Big is live and let live." Bond looked quizzically at Captain Dexter. "In my job," he said, "when I come up against a man like this one, I have another motto. It's live and let die." Dexter shrugged his shoulders. They shook hands, and Dexter flagged a cab. As he pulled out into the uptown traffic, Bond and Leiter smiled at each other. "Able guy, I'd say," said Bond. "They all are in his show," said Leiter, "but very touchy about the rights." "Well, how about going up to Harlem tonight?" Bond asked. "Suits me," said Leiter. "I'll drop you at the St. Regis and pick you up about 6:30. Meet you in the King Cole bar on the ground floor. Guess you want to take a look at Mr. Big himself." He grinned. "Well, so do I. But it wouldn't have done to tell Dexter." Up in Harlem, at the big switchboard, the Whisper was dozing over his racing form. All his lines were quiet. Suddenly, a light shone on the right of the board, an important light. "Yes, boss," said the Whisper softly into his headphone. "Tell all eyes," said a deep, slow voice, "to watch out from now on. 2 men. A brief description of Leiter and Bond followed. "May be coming in this evening or tomorrow. Tell them to watch particularly on 1st to 8 and the other avenues. The night spots, too, in case they're missed coming in. Tell me when you get a sure fix. Got it?" "Yes, sir, boss," said the Whisper, breathing fast. The voice went quiet. The operator took the whole handful of plugs, and soon the big switchboard was alive with winking lights. Softly, urgently, he whispered on into the evening. At 6 o'clock, Bond was awakened by the soft burr of the telephone, as he had arranged before taking an afternoon siesta. He took a cold shower and dressed carefully. He loaded his Beretta, put up the safety catch, and slipped it into the holster under his jacket. Then he reached under the bed and pulled out his shoes. He put them on and felt better equipped to face the evening. Under the leather, the toe caps were lined with steel. At 6:25, he went down to the King Cole bar and chose a table near the entrance and against the wall. A few minutes later, Felix Leiter came in. "Let's go," he said cheerfully. We'll take a bus on Fifth Avenue. You won't find many cabs that want to go up to Harlem after dark." They walked out of the warm hotel and took the few steps to the bus stop on the avenue. At his switchboard, the Whisper pulled out a plug and connected it on the right of the board. "Yes," said the deep voice.
"Buzz, two of 'em's just come in on Fifth. The limey with the scar and his friend. Coming north, both of 'em."
He gave the number and probable timing of the bus.
"Right,"
said the quiet voice.
"Call off all eyes on the other avenues. Warn the night spots.
"Okay, Buzz."
And get this to Teehee Johnson, McThing, Blabbermouth Foley, San Miami, and the Flannel."
The voice spoke for 5 minutes.
"Yes, sir, Buzz,"
breathed the Whisper when it had finished. The line went dead. His eyes bright, the Whisper took up a fistful of plugs and started talking to the town. Ma Frazier's was a cheerful contrast to the bitter streets. Bond and Leiter had an excellent meal of little neck clams and fried chicken Maryland with bacon and sweet corn. "We've got to have it," said Leiter. "It's the national dish." It was very civilized in the warm restaurant, and they lingered over their meal. They had a table near the rail round the dance floor. Bond was spellbound. He found many of the girls very beautiful. The music hammered its way into his pulse until he almost forgot what he was there for. "Gets you, doesn't it?" said Leiter at long last. "I could stay here all night, but we better move along. I'll pay a visit to the washroom while you get the check. See if I can get a line on where we're likely to find Mr. Big tonight. We don't want to have to go to all his places." Bond paid the check and met Leiter downstairs in the narrow entrance hall. Leiter drew him outside, and they walked up the street looking for a cab. "Cost me $20, said Leiter. "But the word is he'll be at the Boneyard. Small place on Lenox Avenue. Quite close to his headquarters. Hottest strip in town. Girl called Gigi Sumatra. We'll have another drink at the Yeah Man and hear the piano. Move on about 12:30. The big switchboard, now only a few blocks away, was almost quiet. The two men had been checked in and out of Ma Frazier's, and midnight had them entering the Yeah Man. At 12:30 the final call came, and then the board was silent. Mr. Big spoke on the house phone, first to the head waiter.
"Two white men coming in 5 minutes. Give them table Z."
"Yes, sir, boss," said the head waiter. Mr. Big made 2 more calls on the house phone, one to the master of ceremonies.
"Lights out at the end of Gigi's act."
"Yes, sir, boss," said the MC with alacrity. The other call was to 4 men who were playing craps in the basement. It was a long call and very detailed. The Boneyard was not a large room, perhaps 60-foot square. There were about 50 tables, and the customers were packed in like black olives in a jar. Bond and Leiter at their table had just ordered a round of drinks when there was a burst of applause. The MC had come out onto the dance floor, a tall Negro in immaculate tails with a red carnation in his buttonhole. He stood holding up his hands. A single white spotlight caught him. The rest of the room went dark. There was silence. "Folks," announced the MC with a broad flash of gold and white teeth, "this is it." He flung out his right hand. Another spot came on. 4 grinning Negroes in flame-colored shirts and peg-top white trousers were revealed, squatting astride 4 tapering barrels with rawhide membranes. "Voodoo drummers from Haiti," whispered Leiter. There was silence. With the tips of their fingers, the drummers began a slow, broken beat, a soft rumba shuffle. "And now, friends," announced the MC, "here she is, Gigi Sumatra." There was pandemonium in the room, a frenzy of applause. The door behind the drums burst open, and 2 huge Negroes, naked except for gold loincloths, ran out onto the floor, carrying between them, her arms round their necks, a tiny figure, swathed completely in black ostrich feathers, a black domino across her eyes. They put her down in the middle of the floor. She took 2 paces forward. There was absolute silence save for the soft thud of the drums. The girl put her hand up to her throat, and the cloak of black feathers came away from the front of her body and spread out into a 5-foot black fan. She whirled it slowly behind her until it stood up like a peacock's tail. She was naked except for a brief V of black lace and a black sequined star in the center of each breast and the thin black domino across her eyes. Her body was small, hard, bronze, and beautiful. It was slightly oiled and glinted in the white light. Her naked stomach started to revolve slowly in time with the rhythm. She swept the black feathers across and behind her again, and her hips started to grind in time with the bass drum. Now each part of her body seemed to be keeping a different beat. Her lips were bared slightly from her teeth. The drums thudded faster, and she tossed the big fan off the floor and held her arms up high above her head. Suddenly, she plucked the sequined star off her right breast and threw it into the audience. A quiet growl arose from the spectators. She plucked off the other star. The drums began to crash and roll. The drummer's hands fluttered like grey flannel on the pale membranes. The girl broke into great shuddering jerks. She sank to her knees, and as the rhythm slowly died, so she too went into a last series of juddering spasms. The drums came down to a slow tom-tom beat and shuffle. And then, very suddenly, the whole room was plunged in darkness. In an instant, all Bond's senses were alert. The howling of the mob was disappearing rapidly. At the same time, he felt cold air on his face. He felt as if he was sinking. Something snapped shut above his head. He put his hand out behind him. It touched a moving wall a foot from his back.
"Lights,"
said a voice quietly. At the same time, both his arms were gripped tightly, and he was pressed down into his chair. Opposite him, still at the table, sat Leiter, a huge Negro grasping his elbows. They were in a tiny square cell. To right and left were 2 more Negroes with guns trained on them. There was the sharp hiss of a hydraulic garage lift, and the table settled quietly to the floor. Bond glanced up. There was the faint join of a broad trap door a few feet above their heads. No sound came through it. One of the Negroes grinned. "Take it easy, folks. Enjoy the ride?" he said. Leiter let out one single harsh obscenity. Bond relaxed his muscles, waiting. "Which one is the limey?" asked the Negro who had spoken. He seemed to be in charge. "This one, I guess," said the man who was holding Bond's arms. "He's got the scar." The man in charge frisked Bond expertly with his left hand, legs, thighs, back, and sides. He dug out Bond's gun and handed it to one of the others. "Give that to the boss, T.E., he said. "Take the limey up. You go along with him. The other guys stays here." "Yes, sir," said the man called T.E., a paunchy Negro in a chocolate shirt and lavender-colored peg-top trousers. The Negro who'd been giving the orders turned to Leiter. "You can tell your friend goodbye. You's unlikely to be seeing each other again." Bond's guard whipped him round and shoved him against a section of the wall. It opened on a pivot into a long, bare passage. The man called T.E. pushed past and led the way. The door swung to behind them. Their footsteps echoed down the stone passage. At the end there was a door. They went through into another long passage lit by an occasional bare bulb in the roof. At the end of this passage they came to another door. T.E. knocked, opened it, and led the way through. In a high-backed chair behind an expensive desk, Mr. Big sat looking quietly at them.
"Good morning, Mr. James Bond."
The voice was deep and soft.
"Sit down."
Bond's guard led him across the thick carpet to a low armchair in leather and tubular steel. He released Bond's arms, and Bond sat down and faced the big man across the wide desk. Mr. Big sat looking at him, his head resting against the back of his tall chair. It was a great football of a head, twice the normal size and very nearly round. The skin was grey-black, taut and shining like the face of a week-old corpse in the river. It was hairless, except for some grey-brown fluff above the ears. There were no eyebrows and no eyelashes. The eyes were very steady and penetrating. They were animal eyes, not human, and they seemed to blaze. The nose was wide, the lips thick and dark. The monstrous head was carried on a wide, short neck supported by the shoulders of a giant. Bond knew from the records that he was 6.5 feet tall and weighed 20 stone, and that little of that was fat. But the total impression was awe-inspiring, even terrifying, and Bond could imagine that so ghastly a misfit must have been bent since childhood on revenge against fate and against the world that hated because it feared him. The big man was draped in a dinner jacket. His huge, flat hands rested half-curled on the desk in front of him. There was nothing on the desk save a large intercom and, incongruously, a very small ivory riding crop with a long, thin white lash. There was one high window above Mr. Big's head, but otherwise the walls were solid with bookshelves. Teehee and another Negro stood against the wall behind his chair. Both had guns trained on Bond. The big man's lips rolled slowly back from his teeth. "I have not seen a member of the Secret Service for many years, Mr. Bond. I learned from my friends that you are high up in your service. You have a 00 number, I believe. 007, if I remember right. The significance of that 00 number, they tell me, is that you have had to kill a man in the course of some assignment. There cannot be many 00 numbers in a service which does not use assassination as a weapon. Whom have you been sent over here to kill, Mr. Bond? Not me, by any chance?" Bond remained silent. "It is necessary for you to reply, Mr. Bond. I know much more than I have said. I shall easily detect a lie." Bond believed him. He chose a story he could support and which would cover the facts. "There are English gold coins circulating in America. Edward IV Rose Nobles," he said. "Some have been sold in Harlem. The American Treasury asked for assistance in tracing them, since they must come from a British source. I came up to Harlem to see for myself, with a representative of the American Treasury, who I hope is now safely on his way back to his hotel." "Mr. Leiter is a representative of the Central Intelligence Agency, not of the Treasury," said Mr. Big without emotion. "His position at this moment is extremely precarious." He paused and seemed to reflect. He looked past Bond. "Teehee." "Yes, sir, boss?" "Tie Mr. Bond to his chair." Immediately a broad strap was passed round Bond's body and buckled tight. 2 short straps went round his wrists and tied them to the leather and metal arms. 2 more went round his ankles. Mr. Big pressed down a switch on the intercom. "Send in Miss Solitaire," he said, and centered the switch again. There was a moment's pause, and then a section of the bookcase to the right of the desk swung open. One of the most beautiful women Bond had ever seen came slowly in and closed the door behind her. She stood just inside the room looking at Bond and taking him in slowly, inch by inch, from his head to his feet. "This is an extraordinary woman, Mr. Bond," said the big man in the same soft, quiet voice. "And I am going to marry her because she is unique. I found her in a cabaret in Haiti, where she was born. She was doing a telepathic act which I could not understand. I looked into it, and I still could not understand. There was nothing to understand. It was telepathy. I tell you this to warn you. She is my inquisitor. With this girl it is not necessary to use clumsy methods. She can divine the truth in people." He turned towards the girl. "Draw up a chair," he said. "Tell me if this man lies." The girl said nothing, but took a chair similar to Bond's from beside the wall and pushed it towards him. She sat down almost touching his right knee. She looked into his eyes. Her face was pale. The eyes were blue, alight, and disdainful, but as they gazed into his, with a touch of humor, Bond realized that they contained some message for him personally. It quickly vanished as his own eyes answered. Her hair was blue-black and fell heavily to her shoulders. She had high cheekbones and a wide, sensual mouth. She wore a long evening dress of heavy white silk, whose classical line was broken by the deep folds which fell from her shoulders and revealed the upper half of her breasts. She watched his eyes on her, and nonchalantly drew her forearms together in her lap so that the valley between her breasts deepened. The message was unmistakable, and an answering warmth must have shown on Bond's cold, drawn face. For suddenly the big man picked up the small ivory whip from the desk beside him and lashed across at her, the thong whistling through the air and landing with a cruel bite across her shoulders. Bond winced even more than she did. Her eyes blazed for an instant, and then went opaque.
"Sit up," said the big man softly. "You forget yourself."
She sat slowly more upright. Bond felt a glow of excitement and a quickening of the pulse. He had a friend in the enemy's camp.
"Are you ready, Solitaire?" asked the big man.
"Yes," said the girl in a low, cool voice.
"Mr. Bond, look into the eyes of this girl and repeat the reason for your presence here which you gave me just now."
Bond repeated what he'd said earlier. For a moment he felt an uncanny thrill. Could this girl tell? If she could tell, would she speak for him or against him? There was silence in the room. Bond tried to look indifferent. The girl's eyes came back into focus. She turned away from him and looked at Mr. Big. "He speaks the truth," she said coldly. Mr. Big reflected for a moment. He seemed to decide. He pressed a switch on the intercom.
"Blabbermouth."
Yes, sir, boss.
"You're holding that American lighter."
Yes, sir.
Well, hurt him considerably. Ride him down to Bellevue Hospital and dump him nearby. Got that?"
Yes, sir.
Mr. Big centered the switch. He looked across at Bond.
"Which finger do you use least, Mr. Bond?"
Bond was startled by the question. His mind raced.
"On reflection, I expect you will say the little finger of the left hand," continued the soft voice. "Tee-hee, break the little finger of Mr. Bond's left hand."
The Negro walked jauntily over to Bond. Bond clutched madly at the arms of his chair. The Negro slowly unhinged the little finger of Bond's left hand, immovably bound to the arm of his chair. He held the tip between finger and thumb, and very deliberately started to bend it back, giggling inanely to himself. Bond rolled and heaved, trying to upset the chair, but Tee-hee put his other hand on the chair back and held it there. The sweat poured off Bond's face. Through the increasing pain he could just see the girl's eyes wide upon him, her red lips slightly parted. The finger stood upright, away from the hand. It started to bend slowly backwards towards his wrist. Suddenly it gave. There was a sharp crack.
"That will do," said Mr. Big.
Tee-hee released the mangled finger with reluctance. Bond uttered a soft animal groan and cursed viciously.
The guy ain't got no sense of humor,
commented Tee-hee. Solitaire sat limply back in her chair and closed her eyes.
"Did he have a gun?"
asked Mr. Big.
Yes, sir.
Tee-hee took Bond's Beretta out of his pocket and slipped it across the desk. The big man pumped the shells out onto the desk and slid it over towards Bond. Tee-hee took it and tucked it back into Bond's holster.
"I will explain to you briefly," said Mr. Big, "why it is that you are not dead. Why you have been permitted to enjoy the sensation of pain instead of adding to the pollution of the Harlem River from the folds of what is jocularly known as a cement overcoat. As no doubt you rightly surmise, it would be a nuisance for me to have a lot of busybodies around here asking questions about the disappearance of yourself and your friend, Mr. Leiter. Not more than a nuisance, but for various reasons I wish to concentrate on other matters at the moment. So I decided to leave my card upon each of you and to give you one more solemn warning. You must leave the country today, and Mr. Leiter must transfer to another assignment, that is all. If I see you again, you will die in a manner as ingenious and appropriate as I can devise on that day. Tee-hee, take Mr. Bond to the garage. Tell 2 of the men to take him to Central Park and throw him in the ornamental water. He may be damaged, but not killed."
Yes, sir, boss.
Tee-hee giggled. He undid Bond's ankles, then his wrists. He took Bond's injured hand and twisted it right up his back. Then he undid the strap round Bond's waist with his free hand.
He yanked Bond to his feet, turned him round towards the wall and pushed him forward. He reached over Bond's shoulder and pressed on one of the books in the serried shelves. A large section opened on a central pivot. Bond was pushed through, and the Negro kicked the heavy section back into place. It closed with a double click. From the thickness of the door, Bond guessed it would be soundproof. They were faced by a long, carpeted passage, ending in some stairs that led downwards. Bond groaned. "You're breaking my arm," he said hoarsely. "Look out, I'm going to faint." He stumbled again, trying to measure exactly the Negro's position behind him. "Shut your mouth," said the Negro. But he pulled Bond's hand an inch or two down his back. This was all Bond needed. They were almost at the end of the passage by now, with only a few feet more to the top of the stairs. Bond faltered again, so that the Negro's body bumped into his. This gave him all the range and direction he needed. He bent a little, and his right hand, straight and flat as a board, whipped round and inwards. He felt it thud hard into the target. The Negro screamed shrilly like a wounded rabbit. Bond felt his left arm come free. He whirled round. The Negro had fallen forward on his knees, throwing out his hands for support. Quickly, Bond got behind him, and with all the force he could put behind the steel-capped shoe, he gave one mighty kick below the lavender-coloured seat of the Negro's pants. A final short scream was driven out of the man as he sailed the few feet to the stairs. His head hit the side of the iron banisters, and then, a twisting wheel of arms and legs, he disappeared over the edge, down into the well. There was a short crash as he careened off some obstacle, then a pause, then a mingled thud and crack as he hit the ground. Then silence. Bond wiped the sweat out of his eyes and stood listening. He walked to the head of the stairs and slowly down, moving softly on the balls of his feet. There was only one floor between him and the spread-eagled body below. When he reached the landing, he stopped again and listened. He heard nothing. Teehee was lying on his back. Bond felt no remorse. He frisked the body for a gun and found one stuck in the waistband of the lavender trousers, now stained with blood. It was a Colt .38 Detective Special. All chambers were loaded. Bond nestled the big gun into his palm and smiled grimly. A small door faced him, bolted on the inside. He put his ear to it. The muffled sound of a car engine reached him. This must be the garage. Mr. Big would have spoken on the intercom and warned them that Teehee was bringing him down. They must be wondering what was holding him. They were probably watching the door for the Negro to emerge. He tested the bolt with the edge of his damaged hand. It slipped easily back. With a painful effort, holding the Colt in his good hand, he eased down the handle and whipped the door open. He stood facing sideways like a fencer, so as to offer as small a target as possible. A few feet away stood a black sedan, its engine running. It faced the open double doors of the garage. There was a big Negro at the wheel, and another stood near him, leaning against the rear door. No one else was in view. At the sight of Bond, the Negroes' mouths fell open in astonishment. Then they both dived for their guns. Instinctively, Bond shot first at the man standing, knowing he would be quickest on the draw. The Negro clutched his stomach, staggered 2 steps towards Bond, and collapsed on his face, his gun clattering on the concrete. The man at the wheel screamed as Bond's gun swung onto him. Hampered by the wheel, the Negro's shooting hand was still inside his coat. Bond shot straight into the screaming mouth, and the man's head crashed against the side window. Bond ran round the car and opened the door. The Negro sprawled horribly out. Bond threw his revolver onto the driving seat and yanked the body out onto the ground. He got into the seat and blessed the running engine and the steering wheel gear lever. He slammed the door, rested his injured hand on the left of the wheel, and crashed the lever forward. The handbrake was still on. He had to lean under the wheel to release it with his right hand. The heavy car surged forward. He tore the wheel round right-handed. As he went through the gears, he could see nothing in the driving mirror except the broad bar of light from the garage shining out across the dark, empty street. He had no idea where he was or where he was heading. He kept the big car at 50. He came to some red traffic lights and jumped them. Several more dark blocks, and then there was a lighted avenue. There was traffic, and he paused now until the lights went green. He turned left and was rewarded by a succession of green lights, each one sweeping him on and further away from the enemy. He checked at an intersection and read the signs. He was on Park Avenue and 116th Street. He slowed again at the next street. It was 115th. He was heading downtown, away from Harlem, back into the city. He kept going. He turned off at 60th Street. 15 minutes later, he was walking up the steps of the St. Regis. "It's a message for you, Mr. Bond," said the night porter. It was from Felix Leiter, timed at 4 a.m. "Call me at once," it said. Bond walked to the elevator and was carried up to his floor. He let himself into 2100 and went through into the sitting room. He put a handful of wilted ice cubes into a tall glass, poured in 3 inches of Haig and Haig, and swirled the mixture round in the glass. Then he picked up the telephone. Leiter answered at once. "Thank God you're okay," said Leiter with feeling. "What's the damage?" "Broken finger," said Bond. "How about you?" "Oh, they started off by considering all sorts of ingenious things. Then they seemed to get bored. Suddenly they used the blackjack hard. I went out, and the next thing I knew I was outside the Bellevue Hospital. About 3:30. I got some treatment at the emergency ward and came home. I was worried to hell and gone about you, but after a while the telephone started ringing. Police and FBI. Seems the big man has complained that some fool limey went berserk at the boneyard and killed 3 of his men. 2 waiters and a chauffeur, if you please. Stole one of his cars and got away. Big man is yelling for action. Of course, I warned off the Dicks and the FBI, but they're madder than hell. Apart from all that, Mr. Big will be after you like a nest of hornets. Anyway, I've got some plans fixed. Now you tell. And God, am I glad to hear your voice." Bond gave a detailed account of all that had happened. When he'd finished, Leiter gave a low whistle. "Boy," he said with admiration, "you certainly made a dent in the big man's machine, but you were lucky. That solitaire dame certainly seems to have saved your bacon. Hey, think we can use her?" "Could if we could get near," said Bond. "I should think he keeps her pretty close." "We'll have to think about that another day," said Leiter. "Now we better get moving. I'll get the police surgeon round to you right away. Be along in a quarter of an hour or so. The FBI is covering up for you, reluctantly, of course, and the police are stalling like mad, but they suggest, tactfully, that you should quit town at once. I'll keep an eye on things at this end. You get down to St. Petersburg and see what you can find out down there. It's all fixed. Now jot this down." Bond cradled the telephone against his shoulder and reached for a pencil and paper. "Go ahead," he said. "Pennsylvania Station, track 14. 10:30 this morning, the Silver Phantom. Through train to St. Petersburg via Washington. Car 245, compartment H. Ticket will be on the train. Conductor will have it, in the name of Bryce. Just go to gate 14 and down to the train, then straight to your compartment and lock yourself in until the train starts. When you get there, take a cab and go to the Everglades Cabanas, Gulf Boulevard West on Sunset Beach. Cabbie'll know it. You got all that? And for God's sake, watch out. Big man'll get you if he possibly can, and a police escort to the train would only put the finger on you. Take a cab from the hotel, keep out of sight. You got any questions?" "Sounds fine," said Bond. "Look after yourself, too. You'll be next on the list after me. So long." "I'll watch out," said Leiter. "Bye." It was 6:30, and Bond pulled back the curtains in the sitting room and watched the dawn come up over the city. The police surgeon came and stayed for a painful quarter of an hour. When he'd gone, Bond started packing. He was wondering how soon he could order breakfast when the telephone rang. A girl's voice, low and urgent, asked for Mr. Bond. "Who's calling?" he asked, gaining time. He knew the answer. "I know it's you," said the voice. "This is Solitaire." The name was scarcely breathed into the telephone. Bond waited, all his senses pricked to what might be the scene at the other end of the line. Was she alone? Was she speaking foolishly on a house phone with extensions to which other listeners were now coldly, intently glued? Or was she in a room with only Mr. Big's eyes bent carefully on her? "Listen," said the voice. "I've got to be quick. You must trust me. I'm in a drugstore, but I must get back at once to my room. Bond had his handkerchief out. He spoke into it. If I can reach Mr. Bond, what shall I tell him? Oh, damn you, said the girl, with what sounded like a genuine touch of hysteria. I've got to get away. You've got to take me. I'll help you. I know a lot of his secrets, but be quick. I'm risking my life here talking to you. She gave a sob of exasperation and panic. Oh, for God's sake, trust me. Bond still paused, his mind working furiously. If it was acting, it was good acting. It was still an unpardonable gamble, but Bond decided. He spoke directly into the telephone, his voice low. Be at Pennsylvania Station at 10:20 exactly. The Silver Phantom to... He hesitated. To Washington. Car 245, compartment H. Say you're Mrs. Bryce. Conductor has the ticket in case I'm not there already. Go straight to the compartment and wait for me. You got that? Yes, said the girl. Don't be seen, said Bond. Wear a veil or something. Of course, said the girl. I promise, I really promise. I must go now. She rang off. Bond looked at the dead receiver and then put it down on the cradle. Well, he said aloud, that's torn it. Up in Harlem, at the big switchboard, the Whisper was talking to the town again, passing Bond's description to all eyes. All the railroads, all the airports, 5th Avenue and 55th Street doors into St. Regis. Mr. Big says we get a chance to highways. Pass it down the line. All the railroads, all the airports. Bond was missed as he came out of the hotel, but was immediately spotted as he left his cab at the drive-in to Pennsylvania Station. A lounging Negro with a wicker basket walked quickly into a call box. It was 10:15. Only 15 minutes to go, and yet, just before the train started, one of the waiters in the diner reported sick, and was hurriedly replaced by a man who'd received a full and careful briefing on the telephone. The chef swore there was something fishy, but the new man said a word or two to him, and the chef showed the whites of his eyes and went silent, surreptitiously touching the lucky bean that hung round his neck on a string. Bond walked quickly down the great glass-covered concourse and through gate 14 to his train. A Pullman porter stood at the door of car 245. "Compartment H?" said Bond. "Mr. Bryce, sir?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Bryce just come aboard. Straight down the car." Bond stepped onto the train and turned down the drab olive-green corridor. H was more than halfway down the car. There was a respectable-looking American couple in E, otherwise the rooms were empty. The door of H was closed. He tried it, and it was locked. "Who's that?" asked a girl's voice anxiously. "It's me," said Bond. The door opened. Bond walked through, put down his bag, and locked the door behind him. She was in a black tailor-made suit. A wide mesh veil came down from the rim of a small black straw hat. One gloved hand was up to her throat, and through the veil Bond could see that her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. A voice on the platform outside called, "Board!" There was a clang as the attendant pulled up the folding iron step and shut the door, and then the train was rolling quietly down the track. A bell clanged monotonously as they passed the automatic signals. There was a slight clatter from the wheels as they crossed some points, and then the train began to accelerate. For better or for worse, they were on their way. Bond sat down with his back to the engine. She sat down, nervously facing him. She took off her hat and unpinned the broad mesh veil and put them on the seat beside her. She took some hairpins out of the back of her hair and shook her head so that the heavy black hair fell forward. There were blue shadows under her eyes, and Bond reflected that she too must have gone without sleep that night. There was a table between them. Suddenly, she reached forward and pulled his right hand towards her on the table. She held it in both her hands and bent forward and kissed it. She looked up, and her wide blue eyes looked candidly into his. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for trusting me. It was difficult for you." She released his hand and sat back. I'm glad I did," said Bond inadequately. He dug in his pocket for his cigarettes and lighter. It was a new pack of Chesterfields, and with his right hand he scrabbled at the cellophane wrapper. She reached over and took the pack from him. She slit it with her thumbnail, took out a cigarette, lit it, and handed it to him. Bond took it from her and smiled. "I smoke about 3 packs a day," he said. "You're going to be busy." "I'll just help with the new packs," she said. "Don't be afraid I'm going to fuss over you all the way to St. Petersburg." Bond's eyes narrowed, and the smile went out of them. "You don't believe I thought we were only going as far as Washington," she said. "You weren't very quick on the telephone this morning. And anyway, Mr. Big was certain you'd make for Florida. I heard him warning his people down there about you. He spoke to a man called the Robber, long distance. Said to watch the airport at Tampa and the trains. Did they see you getting on?" "Not that I know of," said Bond. His eyes had relaxed again. "How about you? Have any trouble getting away?" "It was my day for a singing lesson. He's trying to make a torch singer out of me. One of his men took me to my teacher as usual and was due to pick me up again at midday. They'll be missing me in, about an hour. I waited until the car had gone, then I walked straight out again and took a cab downtown. I bought a toothbrush and a few other things at a drugstore. Otherwise, I've got nothing except my jewelry." She smiled. "I thought I'd get my chance one day. You've given me a new life. I've been shut up with him and his gangsters for nearly a year." "Don't thank me," said Bond. "We're quits now. You saved my life last night. That is," he added, looking at her curiously, "if you really have got second sight." "Yes," she said, "I have. Or something very like it. I can often see what's going to happen, particularly to other people. Of course, I'm brighter on it, and when I was earning my living doing it in Haiti, it was easy to turn it into a good cabaret act. When I first saw you in that room, I knew you'd been sent to save me." She blushed. "I saw all sorts of things." "What sort of things?" "Oh, I don't know," she said, her eyes dancing. "Just things. Anyway, we'll see. But it's going to be difficult and dangerous for both of us. So, will you please take good care of us?" "I'll do my best," said Bond. "The first thing is for us both to get some sleep. Let's have a drink and some chicken sandwiches, and then we'll get the porter to put our beds down. You mustn't be embarrassed," he added, seeing her eyes recoil. "We're in this together. We have to spend 24 hours in a double bedroom together, and it's no good being squeamish. Anyway, you're Mrs. Bryce," he grinned, "and you must act like her, up to a point, anyway." She laughed. Her eyes speculated. She said nothing, but rang the bell below the window. The conductor arrived at the same time as the Pullman attendant. Bond ordered old fashions and stipulated old granddad bourbon, chicken sandwiches, and decaffeinated Sanka coffee so that their sleep would not be spoiled. "I have to collect another fare from you, Mr. Bryce," said the conductor. "Of course," said Bond, pulling out his note-case. When the door shut behind him, Solitaire said, "I'm going in there." She gestured towards the door behind Bond's head. "I must look terrible." "Go ahead, darling," laughed Bond as she disappeared. He turned to the window and watched the pretty clapboard houses slip by as they approached Trenton. He loved trains, and he looked forward with excitement to the rest of the journey. For better or worse, he had decided to accept Solitaire, or rather, in his cold way, to make the most of her. There were many questions to be answered, but now was not the time to ask them. All that immediately concerned him was that another blow had been struck at Mr. Big, where it would hurt most, in his vanity. As for the girl, as a girl, he reflected that it was going to be fun teasing her and being teased back, and he was glad that they had already crossed the frontiers into comradeship and even intimacy. He heard the door unlock. She came back and slid into the seat opposite him. She looked fresh and cheerful. "You've been wondering about me," she said. "I felt it. Don't worry. There's nothing bad to know. I'll tell you all about it someday when we have time. Now, I want to forget about the past. I'll just tell you my real name. It's Simon Luttrell. I'm 25, and now I'm happy. But I'm hungry and sleepy. Which bed will you have?" The crack train thundered on through the bright afternoon towards the south. They left Pennsylvania behind and Maryland. They came to a long halt at Washington. Then they were on into Virginia. Here the air was already softer, and the dusk, only 5 hours away from the bright, frosty breath of New York, smelt almost of spring. They awoke around 7 to the hasty ting of a grade-crossing alarm bell as the big train nosed its way out of the fields into the suburbs of Raleigh. Bond turned on the lights and rang for the attendant. He ordered dry martinis, and when the 2 little personalized bottles appeared with the glasses and the ice, they seemed so inadequate that he at once ordered 4 more. They argued over the menu. The fish was described as being made from flaky, tender, boneless fillets, and the chicken as delicious French fried to a golden brown, served disjointed. "Eyewash," said Bond, and they finally ordered scrambled eggs and bacon and sausages, a salad, and some of the domestic camembert that is one of the most welcome surprises on American menus. They ate in silence for a while, and then Solitaire said suddenly, "I wonder who he's got on the train. You can be certain it's a Negro, either a Pullman attendant or someone in the diner. He can make these people do absolutely anything he likes." "So it seems," said Bond. "But how does it work? What's he got on them?" "Well, they believe he's the zombie of Baron Samedi. Zombies are bad enough by themselves. They're animated corpses that have been made to rise from the dead and obey the commands of the person who controls them. Baron Samedi is the most dreadful spirit in the whole of voodooism. He's the spirit of darkness and death. So for Baron Samedi to be in control of his own zombie is a very dreadful conception. You know what Mr. Big looks like. He's huge and grey, and he has great psychic power. It's not difficult for a Negro to believe that he is a zombie, and a very bad one at that. And I can tell you that it works, and that there's hardly a Negro who has seen him and heard the story who doesn't believe it, and who doesn't regard him with complete and absolute dread. And they're right. And you'd say so too if you knew the way he deals with those who disobey him, the way they're tortured and killed." "Why doesn't someone kill him?" asked Bond. "You can't kill him," she said. "He's already dead. He's a zombie." She smiled at him. "You must think me a hopeless fool," she said. Bond put his hand across the table and covered hers with it. "When the time comes," he said, "I'll cut a cross in my bullet. That used to work in the old days." He smiled. "You get ready for bed now, and I'll climb up after you and kiss you good night. Call me when you're there." He went out into the corridor and stood gazing out of the window, deep in thought. The great train snaked on through the dark, pounding out the miles through the empty plains and tiny hamlets of Georgia, the Peach State, the angry moan of its 4-toned wind horn echoing over the wide savannah, and the long shaft of its single searchlight ripping the black calico of the night. The next day, as a precaution, they left the train at Clearwater, the last station before St. Petersburg. Bond took a cab and gave the address on Treasure Island, half an hour's drive away. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun blazed down out of a cloudless sky. Solitaire insisted on taking off her hat and veil. "It's sticking to my face," she said. "Hardly a soul has ever seen me down here." A big Negro with a face pitted with ancient smallpox was held up in his cab at the same time as they were checked at the intersection of Park Street and Central Avenue, where the avenue runs onto the long Treasure Island Causeway across the shallow waters of Boca Ciega Bay. When the Negro saw Solitaire's profile, his mouth fell open. He pulled his cab into the curb and dived into a drugstore. He called a St. Petersburg number.
"This is Boxy," he said urgently into the mouthpiece. "Give me the rubber and step on it. That you, rubber? Listen, the big man must be in town." "What do you mean you just talked with him in New York? I just seen his gal in a Clearwater cab heading over the causeway. Sure, I'm certain. Couldn't mistake that eyeful. With a man in a blue suit and a gray hat, scarred on his face."
The man called the robber was through to New York in 5 minutes. He'd been warned about Bond, but he couldn't understand where Solitaire tied into the picture. When he'd finished talking to the big man, he still didn't know, but his instructions were quite definite. He rang off and sat for a while, drumming his fingers on his desk. 10 grand for the job. He'd need 2 men. That would leave 8 grand for him. He licked his lips and called a pool room in a downtown bar in Tampa. Bond paid off the cab at the Everglades, a group of neat white and yellow clapboard cottages,
set on 3 sides of a square of Bahama grass, which ran 50 yards down to a bone-white beach and then to the sea. He went through a door marked Office, with Solitaire demurely at his heels. He rang a bell that said, Manageress, Mrs. Stuyvesant, and a withered shrimp of a woman with blue-rinsed hair appeared and smiled with her pinched lips. Mr. and Mrs. Bryce, said Bond innocently. Oh, yes, Mr. Bryce. Cabana number 1, right down on the beach. If you'd care to sign the register, I'm sure you and Mrs. Bryce would like to freshen up after the journey. The full address, please. Thank you. The formalities over, they left the office and walked down the cement path to the end cottage on the left. It was small and simply furnished, with bamboo beach chairs upholstered in foam rubber. Palm leaf matting covered the floors. There were broad windows facing the sea. While they unpacked and made themselves comfortable, Bond told Solitaire what he knew about the Ouroboros Worm and Bait Shippers Company and the man known as the Robber. When he told her that he was going to go down right away to look the place over, a shadow of fear passed across her eyes. She didn't want to be left alone. She clung to him desperately. I have a feeling, she said, a bad feeling. Bond did his best to reassure her. He left her standing in the doorway of the little cabin as he went off to look for a cab to take him down to the waterfront. The fear was still in her eyes. Bond left the cab beside the harbour and sauntered along past a timber warehouse and some oil storage tanks. Then he turned left towards the sea. The side road ended at a small, weather-beaten wooden jetty that reached out 20 feet on barnacled piles into the bay. Right up against its open gate was a long, low, corrugated iron warehouse. Over its wide double doors was painted, black on white, the words Ouroboros Incorporated, Live Worm and Bait Merchants, Coral, Shells, Tropical Fish. In one of the double doors there was a smaller door with a gleaming Yale lock. On the door was a sign, Private, Keep Out. Against this, a man sat on a kitchen chair, its back tilted so that the door supported his weight. He was cleaning a rifle, a Remington 30 it looked like to Bond. He had a wooden toothpick sticking out of his mouth and a battered baseball cap on the back of his head. He was around 40, and his face was as knotted and seamed as the mooring posts on the jetty. It was a thin, hatchet face, and the lips were thin too, and bloodless. He looked cruel and cold, like the bad man in a film about poker players and gold mines. If that isn't the robber, thought Bond grimly, it's a blood relation. He walked up to the man casually. Good afternoon, he said pleasantly. You the manager of this wharf? Yep, said the man without looking up. I wondered if there was any chance of mooring my boat here. Basin's pretty crowded. What's the name of your boat? The Sybil, said Bond. Ain't no such boat in the basin, said the man. He clicked the breech shut on his rifle. It lay casually on his lap. The rifle started to move lazily in a low arc. The man's left hand was at the trigger, his right just in front of the trigger guard, pivoting the gun. It's been there a week, said Bond. 60-foot twin-screw diesel. Want to be prosecuted for trespass? Said the man. This is private property. Now get the hell out of here. You got a gun. I can smell it. I've had a belly full of you lousy dicks around here lately, breathing down my neck. Sybil, my ass. He got up abruptly, went through the door and slammed it so that the frame rattled. Round one to the robber, thought Bond. He moved back up the dusty side road. At the end of the road he turned and looked back at the warehouse. He studied it carefully for a quarter of an hour, noting the layout and general structure. The sun was setting now, and a big arc light came on over the door. The approach to the warehouse was suddenly stripped of shadows. No good trying anything from the front, Bond mused. But there's never been a warehouse yet with only one entrance. He decided to walk back to the Everglades in order to give himself time to think things over and decide on his next move. By the time he reached the cabins, he'd been away a couple of hours. Mrs. Stuyvesant greeted him on the lawn. She looked annoyed and a little worried. "Pardon me, Mr. Bryce," she said, "but I'm afraid we can't allow music here. I can't have the other guests disturbed at all hours." Bond looked at her in astonishment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Stuyvesant. I don't quite understand." "That big radiogram you had sent round," she said. "The men could hardly get the packing case through the door." Bond left her in mid-sentence and raced down to the end cottage. Solitaire had not put up much of a struggle. The lock of the bedroom had been forced with one swift wrench of a jemmy. Then they must have gagged her or knocked her out and doubled her into the packing case and nailed it up. There were tire marks at the back of the cottage where the truck had stood. Almost blocking the entrance hall was a huge, old-fashioned radiogram. Bond cursed himself bitterly for leaving her alone. He couldn't guess how she'd been traced so quickly. It was just another example of the big man's machine. He put through a call to the FBI headquarters at Tampa. "Airports, railroad terminals, and the highways," he concluded, after giving them the details. "You'll get blanket orders from Washington just as soon as I've spoken to them. I guarantee they'll give this top priority." He hung up. Thank God they were cooperating. He sat gloomily for a while, drinking and staring out across the sand, bone-white in the light of the moon, towards the endless, dark sea. Then he went into the bedroom and climbed between the sheets where her warm body had lain, and, before he slept, he had made up his mind. He would go after the robber and strangle the truth out of him. He was certain in his own mind that the man must have had a big hand in the kidnapping. He thought again of the man's little cruel eyes and the thin, pale lips. Then, his mind made up, he relaxed his body into sleep. Bond woke around 3 a.m., slipped out of bed and dressed quietly. He checked his gun and set off for the warehouse. It was a bright, moonlit night and the streets were quiet and deserted. It took him almost an hour to reach the little side road and the old jetty. There was no one around, and no sound except the quiet lapping of the small waves against the sea wall and the water gurgling under the empty wharf. The top of the low sea wall was about 3 feet wide. It was in shadow for the 300 yards or more that separated him from the long, black outline of the Ouroboros warehouse. He climbed onto it and walked carefully and silently along between the buildings and the sea. As he got nearer, a steady, high-pitched whine became louder, and by the time he dropped down on the wide cement parking space at the back of the building, it was a muted scream. He had expected something of the sort. The noise came from the air pumps and the heating systems. He'd also relied on the fact that most of the roof would certainly be of glass to admit sunlight during the day. He was not disappointed. The whole of the south wall of the warehouse, from just above the level of his head, was of plate glass, and through it he could see the moonlight shining down through half an acre of glass roofing. High above him, and well out of reach, broad windows were open to the night air. There was a small door low down, but it was locked and bolted, and leaded wires near the hinges suggested some form of burglar alarm. Bond was not interested in the door. Following his hunch, he had come equipped for an entry through glass. He cast about for something that would raise him an extra 2 feet. He soon found what he wanted. It was a discarded, heavy-gauge tire. He rolled it to the wall of the warehouse, away from the door, and took off his shoes. He put bricks against the bottom edges of the tire to hold it steady and hoisted himself up. The steady scream of the pumps gave him protection, and he at once set to work with a small glass cutter which he'd bought, together with a hunk of putty, on his way back from the warehouse through town the previous evening. When he'd cut down the 2 vertical sides of one of the yard's square panes, he pressed the putty against the center of the glass and worked it into a protruding knob. He then went to work on the lateral edges of the pane. While he worked, he gazed through into the moonlight vistas of the huge repository. The endless rows of tanks stood on wooden trestles with narrow passages between. Under the trestles he could see long tanks and trays let into the floor. Just below him, broad racks covered with regiments of seashells jutted out from the walls. There was a light metal runway suspended from the roof over each row of tanks, and he guessed that any individual tank could be lifted out and brought to the exit for shipment or to extract sick fish for quarantine. After a quarter of an hour's meticulous work, there was a slight cracking noise, and the pane came away attached to the putty knob in his hand. He climbed down and put the pane carefully on the ground away from the tire. Then he stuffed his shoes inside his shirt. With only one good hand, they might be vital weapons. He listened. There was no sound but the unfaltering whine of the pumps. He got back on top of the tire and heaved his body through the wide hole he'd made. In a moment he was down on the floor, listening with all his senses for any noise behind the whine of the machinery. There was none. He took his steel-tipped shoes out of his shirt and left them on the floor. Then he moved off with a pencil flashlight in his hand. He was in the aquarium fish section, and as he examined the labels he caught flashes of coloured light from the deep tanks, and occasionally a piece of living jewellery would materialize and briefly goggle at him before he moved on. Underneath, sunk in the floor, and most of them covered with chicken wire, there were tray upon tray, swarming and heaving with worms and bait. There was the fetid smell of a mangrove swamp in the air, and the temperature was in the high 70s. Soon he began to sweat slightly and to long for the clean night air. He'd moved to the central passageway before he found the poison fish, which were one of his objectives. When he'd read about them in the files of the police headquarters in New York, he'd made a mental note that he would like to know more about this sideline of the peculiar business of Ouroboros Incorporated. Here the tanks were smaller, and there was generally only one specimen in each. Here the eyes that looked sluggishly at him were cold and hooded, and an occasional fang was bared at the torch, or a spined backbone slowly swelled. Each tank bore an ominous skull and crossbones in chalk, and there were large labels that said, "Very dangerous," and "Keep off." Bond's eyes narrowed as he noticed that in all the dangerous tanks, the mud or sand on the bottom occupied nearly half the tank. He chose a tank containing a 6-inch scorpionfish. He knew something of the habits of this deadly species, and in particular that they do not strike but poison only on contact. The top of the tank was on a level with his waist. He took out a strong pocket knife and opened the longest blade. Then he leant over the tank, and with his sleeve rolled up, he deliberately aimed his knife for the center of the craggy head between the overhung grottos of the eye sockets. As his hand broke the surface of the water, the white dinosaur spine stood threateningly erect, and the mottled stripes of the fish turned a muddy brown. Bond lunged swiftly. He pinned the bulging head down as the tail threshed wildly, and slowly drew the fish towards him and up the side of the tank. He stood aside and whipped it out onto the floor. He leant over the tank and plunged his hand deep into the center of the mud and sand. Yes, they were there. His hunch about the poison fish had been right. His fingers felt the close row of coins deep under the mud, like counters in a box. They were in a flat tray. He could feel the wooden partitions. He pulled out a coin, rinsing it and his hand in the cleaner surface water as he did so. He shone his torch on it. It was as big as a modern 5-shilling piece and nearly as thick, and it was gold. It bore the arms of Spain and the head of Philip II. He looked at the tank, measuring it. There must be 1,000 coins in this one tank that no customs officer would think of disturbing. $10,000 to $20,000 worth, guarded by one poison-fanged Cerberus. These must be the cargo brought in by the secretary on her last trip a week ago. 100 tanks. Say $150,000 worth of gold per trip. It was a scheme after Mr. Big's philosophy. Effective, technically brilliant, almost foolproof. Bond bent to the floor and speared the scorpionfish in the side. He dropped it back in the tank. There was no point in divulging his knowledge to the enemy. It was as he turned away from the tank that all the lights in the warehouse suddenly blazed, and a voice of sharp authority said, "Put your hands up, don't move an inch." As Bond took a rolling dive under the tank, he caught a glimpse of the lank figure of the robber squinting down the sights of his rifle about 20 yards away, up against the main entrance. As he dived, the rifle cracked, and the scorpionfish tank above his head splintered sharply, and water gushed down. Bond sprinted fast between the tanks, back towards his only means of retreat. Just as he turned the corner, there was another shot, and a tank of angelfish exploded like a bomb just beside his ear. He was now at his end of the warehouse, with the robber at the other, 50 yards away. There was no possible chance of jumping for his window on the other side of the central passageway. He realized that the lines of tanks would only protect him to the knees, and that between the tanks he would be in full view down the narrow passages. Either way, he couldn't stand still.
A shot whammed between his legs into a pile of conches, sending splinters of their hard china buzzing round him like wasps. He ran to his right, and another shot came at his legs. It hit the floor and zoomed into a huge carboy of clams that split in half and emptied 100 shellfish over the floor. Bond raced back, taking long, quick strides. He had his Beretta out and loosed off 2 shots as he crossed the central passageway. He saw the robber jump for shelter as a tank shattered above his head. He heard a shout, drowned by the crash of glass and water. He immediately dropped to one knee and fired 2 shots at the robber's legs, but 50 yards for his small-caliber pistol was too much. Then the robber was shooting again, and Bond could only dodge to and fro behind the cases and wait to be caught in the kneecap. Occasionally he fired a shot in return to make the robber keep his distance, but he knew the battle was lost. The other man seemed to have endless ammunition. Bond had only 2 shots left in his gun and 1 fresh clip in his pocket. He decided to give up. He had 1 ruse to fall back on, and any change in the battle was better than exhausting himself at the wrong end of this deadly coconut shy. As he passed a row of cases, of which the one near him was shattered, he pushed it onto the floor. It was still half full of rare Siamese fighting fish, and Bond was pleased with the expensive crash as the remains of the tank burst in fragments on the floor. A wide space was cleared on the trestle table, and after making 2 quick darts to pick up his shoes, he dashed back to the table and jumped up. With no target for the robber to shoot at, there was a moment's silence save for the whine of the pumps. Bond slipped his shoes on and laced them tight.
"Hey, Limey,"
called the robber patiently.
"Come on out. I've been expecting you, and I got plenty of ammo."
"Guess I've got to give up," answered Bond through cupped hands.
"You smashed one of my ankles." "I'll not shoot," called the robber. "Drop your gun on the floor. Come down the central passage with your hands up. We'll have a quiet little talk."
Bond dropped his Beretta with a clatter onto the cement floor. He took the gold coin out of his pocket and clenched it in his bandaged left hand. He dragged his left leg behind him as he limped heavily up the central passage. His hands held level with his shoulders. He stopped halfway up the passage. The robber came slowly towards him, half crouching, his rifle pointed at Bond's stomach. Bond was glad to see that his shirt was soaked and that he had a cut over the left eye. The robber walked well to the left of the passageway. When he was about 10 yards away from Bond, he paused with 1 foot casually resting on a small obstruction in the cement floor. He gestured with his rifle.
"Higher,"
he said harshly. Bond groaned and lifted his hands a few inches, so that they were almost across his face as if in defense. Between the fingers he saw the robber's toe kick something sharply sideways, and there was a faint clang as if a bolt had been drawn. Bond's eyes glinted behind his hands and his jaw tightened. The robber came on, his hard, thin frame obscuring the spot where he had paused.
"I've got to sit down,"
Bond groaned.
"My leg, it won't hold me."
The robber stopped a few feet away. He bared his tobacco-stained teeth.
"Ha! You'll soon be lying down, and for keeps."
Bond sagged, and at that moment he dropped the gold coin out of his left hand. It clanged on the cement floor and started to roll. In the fraction of a second that the robber's eyes flickered down, Bond's right foot in its steel-capped shoe lashed out to its full length. It kicked the rifle almost out of the robber's hands. At the same moment that the robber pulled the trigger and the bullet crashed harmlessly through the glass ceiling, Bond launched himself in a dive at the man's stomach, his 2 arms flailing. Both hands connected with something soft and brought a grunt of agony. Bond bore on into the man, hitting with both hands, ignoring the pain, his head down between hunched shoulders, forcing the man back and off his balance. As he felt the balance yield, he straightened himself slightly and lashed out again with his steel-capped foot. It connected with the robber's kneecap. There was a scream of agony, and the rifle clattered to the ground as the robber tried to save himself. He was halfway to the floor when Bond's uppercut hit him and projected the body another few feet. The robber fell in the center of the passage. Just opposite what Bond could now see was a drawn bolt in the floor.
As the body hit the ground, a section of the floor turned swiftly on a central pivot, and the robber almost disappeared down the black opening of a wide trap-door in the concrete. As he felt the floor give under his weight, the robber gave a shrill scream of terror, and his hands scrabbled for a hold. They caught the edge of the floor and clutched it just as his whole body slid into space, and the 6-foot panel of reinforced concrete revolved smoothly until it rested upright on its pivot, a black rectangle yawning on either side. Bond walked to the edge of the right-hand hole and looked down. The robber's terrified face, the lips drawn back from the teeth, and the eyes madly distended, jabbered up at him. Looking beyond him, Bond could see nothing, but he heard the lapping of water against the foundations of the building, and there was a faint luminescence on the seaward side. Bond guessed that there was access to the sea through wire or narrow bars. As the robber's voice died down to a whimper, Bond could hear something stirring down there, awoken by the light. Something big by the sound of it. "Pull me out! Give me a break!" The robber's voice was a hoarse whisper of supplication. "I can't hold much longer. I'll do anything you want. Tell you anything." "What happened to Solitaire?" Bond stared down into the frenzied eyes. "The big man did it. Told me to fix a snatch. 2 men in Tampa. Ask for Butch and the lifer. Pool room behind the Oasis." Bond looked down coldly at the white fingers desperately clinging to the sharp edge of concrete. For a moment he was tempted. Then he leaned forward and held out his good hand to grasp the robber's left wrist. As Bond leaned down, the robber released his hold with his left hand and lunged up desperately. His hand grasped Bond's arm, and he pulled with all his strength. Bond, caught off balance, tried to throw himself backwards, and the robber's scrabbling fingers slipped from his arm, slippery with sweat. With a cry, the robber tried to regain his hold on the concrete edge with his left hand. As he misjudged the distance, his right hand, now bearing the full weight of his body, lost its grip, and he fell backwards and downwards with a scream, his arms and legs threshing madly in the air. There was a splash as he hit the water below, and then a terrible snuffling grunt, as if a great pig was getting its mouth full. Bond knew it for the grunt that a shark makes, as its hideous flat nose comes up out of the water, and its sickle-shaped mouth closes on a floating carcass. Bond shuddered. He walked to the side of the trap-door and pushed the upright concrete slab. It revolved easily on its central pivot. He kicked the bolt home with his foot. He collected the gold coin off the floor and picked up his Beretta. He went to the main entrance and looked back for a moment at the shambles of the battlefield. He reflected that there was nothing to show that the secret of the treasure had been discovered. The top had been shot off the scorpionfish tank under which he had dived, and when the other men came in the morning, they would not be surprised to find the fish dead in the tank. They would report to Mr. Big that the robber had been worsted in a gun battle. They'd find some of Bond's bullets and soon guess that it was his work. He turned off the lights and let himself out by the main entrance. A small payment had been made on account of Solitaire. It was 6 o'clock on the evening of the next day when Bond's plane touched down in Jamaica. Strangeways, the chief Secret Service agent for the Caribbean, was at the airport to meet him, and he was quickly through customs and immigration. Strangeways was a lean, humorous man of about 35, a former lieutenant commander in the special branch of the RNVR. He had a black patch over one eye and the sort of aquiline good looks that are associated with the bridge of a destroyer. On the comfortable veranda of his neat white house on the Junction Road below Stony Hill, he poured Bond a strong whisky and soda, and then gave a concise account of the whole of the Jamaica end of the case. It had always been rumoured that there was treasure on the Isle of Surprise, and everything that was known about Captain Morgan the pirate supported the rumour. The tiny island lay in the exact centre of Shark Bay, a small harbour that lies at the end of the Junction Road, that runs across the thin waste of Jamaica from Kingston to the north coast. The great buccaneer had made Shark Bay his headquarters. He always anchored his ships in the lee of the Isle of Surprise, a precipitous lump of coral that surges straight up out of the centre of the bay, and is surmounted by a jungly plateau of about an acre. When, in 1683, Morgan left Jamaica for the last time, he left his treasure behind, and he died in penury without revealing its whereabouts. It must have been a vast hoard, the fruits of innumerable treasure ships sailing for the plate, but it vanished without trace.
It was always thought that the secret lay somewhere on the Isle of Surprise, but for 200 years the diving and digging of treasure hunters yielded nothing. Then, said Strangeways, just 6 months before, two things had happened within a few weeks. A young fisherman disappeared from the village of Shark Bay and had not been heard of since, and an anonymous New York syndicate purchased the island for £1,000. A few weeks after the sale, the yacht Secretaire put into Shark Bay and dropped anchor in the lee of the island. It was manned entirely by Negroes. They went to work and cut a stairway in the rock face of the island, and erected on the summit a number of low-lying shacks in the fashion known in Jamaica as wattle and daub. They were a taciturn and orderly lot who gave no trouble. They explained to the customs which they'd cleared in neighbouring Port Maria that they were there to catch tropical fish, especially the poisonous varieties, and collect rare shells for Ouroboros Incorporated in St. Petersburg. For a week they carried out blasting operations on the island, and it was given out that these were for the purpose of excavating a large fish tank. The Secretaire began a fortnightly shuttle service with the Gulf of Mexico, and watchers with binoculars confirmed that before each sailing, consignments of portable fish tanks were taken aboard. Canoes approaching the island were warned off. No one succeeded in landing on the island by daylight, and after 2 tragic attempts, nobody tried to gain access by night. The first attempt was made by a local fisherman spurred on by the rumours of buried treasure that no talk of tropical fish could suppress. He had swum out one dark night, and his body had been washed back over the reef next day. Sharks and barracuda had left nothing but the trunk and the remains of a thigh. At about the time he should have reached the island, the whole village of Shark Bay was awakened by the most horrible drumming noise. It seemed to come from inside the island. It was recognized as the beating of voodoo drums. It started softly and rose to a thunderous crescendo. Then it died down again and stopped. It lasted about 5 minutes. By this time, Strangeways was interested, and he made a full report to London, who followed it up with Washington. It came to light that the New York syndicate that had purchased the island was wholly owned by Mr. Big. This was 3 months ago. Strangeways was ordered to penetrate the island at all costs and find out what was going on. He mounted quite an operation. He rented a property on the western arm of Shark Bay called Beau Desert, a beach house directly across from the Secretaire's anchorage up against Surprise. He brought down 2 very fine swimmers from the naval base at Bermuda and set up a permanent watch on the island day and night. Nothing of a suspicious nature was seen, and on a dark, calm night he sent out the 2 swimmers with instructions to make an underwater survey of the foundations of the island. An hour after they had left to swim across the 300 yards of water, the terrible drumming had started up somewhere inside the cliffs of the island. That night, the 2 men did not return. On the next day, they were both washed up at different parts of the bay, or rather, the remains left by the shark and barracuda. At this point in Strangeways' narrative, Bond interrupted him. "What's all this about shark and barracuda? They're not generally savage in these waters. Anyway, I don't believe either of them attack humans unless there's blood in the water." "That's right," said Strangeways, "and my men had harpoons and knives. You can imagine how I felt about it. Since then we've done nothing except try and get legitimate access to the island via the Colonial Office in Washington. Damn slow business, particularly as there's nothing against these people. They seem to have pretty good protection in Washington and some smart international lawyers. We're absolutely stuck. London told me to hang on until you came." "What are the Secretaire's movements?" asked Bond. "Still in Cuba, sailing in about a week, according to the CIA. "How many trips has she done?" "About 20. Bond multiplied $150,000 by 20. If his guess was right, Mr. Big had already taken £1 million in gold out of the island. "I've made some provisional arrangements for you," said Strangeways. "There's the house at Beau Desert, and I've got you a car. You can get in a bit of training till the Secretary comes in. You'll need to be fit if you're going to try and get over to Surprise, and I honestly believe that's the only answer." "Yes," said Bond thoughtfully. "Anything else you'd like me to fix up?" asked Strangeways. "Well, you might ask London to get the Admiralty to lend us one of their scuba outfits, and plenty of spares, and a couple of good underwater harpoon guns. The French ones called Champion are the best. A good underwater torch, a commando dagger, all the dope they can get from the Natural History Museum on barracuda and shark, and, oh yes, one of those things our saboteurs used against ships in the war, a limpet mine with assorted fuses. After breakfast next morning, Strangeways appeared on the veranda and handed Bond the keys of his car. An hour later, Bond started off up the Junction Road. By 10:30, he'd passed through Port Maria and branched off along the little parochial road that runs down to Shark Bay. Round a turning, he suddenly came on the bay lying below him in the sunshine, and he stopped the car and got out. The bay was crescent-shaped, perhaps 3/4 of a mile wide at its arms. Its blue surface was ruffled by a light breeze blowing from the northeast. A mile from where Bond stood, a long line of breakers showed the reef just outside the bay, and the narrow, untroubled waters of the passage, which was the only entrance to the anchorage. In the centre of the crescent, the Isle of Surprise rose 100 feet sheer out of the water, small waves creaming against its easterly base. It was nearly round, and it looked like a tall grey cake, topped with green icing on a blue china plate. Bond had stopped about 100 feet above the little cluster of fishermen's huts behind the palm-fringed beach of the bay, and he was level with the flat green top of the island 1/2 mile away. He saw the thatched roofs of the wattle and daub shanties among the trees in the centre of the island. He examined them carefully through his binoculars, but there was no sign of life, except for a thin wisp of smoke blowing away with the breeze. Below him, the water of the bay was pale green on the white sand. Then it deepened to dark blue just before the broken brown of an inner reef that made a wide semicircle 100 yards from the island. To his left, in the middle of the western arms of the bay, deep among the trees behind a tiny white sand beach, was his base of operations, Beau Desert. Bond stood for 10 minutes examining the 300-yard stretch of sea between it and the Secretary's anchorage up against the island. Then he turned the car round and got back on the main coast road. The next day, Bond started his training from his base at Beau Desert. Every morning he swam a mile up the beach before breakfast and then ran back along the firm sand to the bungalow. At about 9, he set out in a canoe, the single triangular sail taking him fast through the water up the coast to Orange Bay. Here he would beach the canoe and go out with a spear and a mask and an old underwater harpoon gun on breathtaking expeditions in the sort of waters he would encounter in Shark Bay. By the end of a week, he was sunburned and hard. He had cut his cigarettes down to 10 a day and had not had a single drink. He could swim 2 miles without tiring, his hand was almost completely healed, and all the scales of big city life had fallen from him. Towards nightfall on the 8th day, he came back to the bungalow to find Strangeways waiting for him. "Got some good news for you," he said. "I've got all the gear, and the Secretary sails tomorrow for Surprise. After clearing at Port Maria, they should anchor before nightfall. Mr. Biggs on board. Only the second time he's been down here. Oh, and they've got a woman with them. Girl called Solitaire, according to the CIA. Know anything about her?" "Not much," said Bond, "but I'd like to get her away from him. She's not one of his team." Bond went out on the veranda and gazed up at the stars. Never before in his life had there been so much to play for. The secret of the treasure, the defeat of a great criminal, the smashing of a communist spy ring, and the destruction of a tentacle of Smersh, the cruel machine that was his own private target. And now Solitaire, the ultimate personal prize. The stars winked down their cryptic Morse, and he had no key to their cipher. The next day Bond slept till lunchtime, and then he went over the gear from London that had been sent across from Kingston by Strangeways. He tried on the black neoprene suit and tested the twin cylinders, each containing 1,000 litres of free air compressed to 200 atmospheres. There was a new and powerful Champion harpoon gun and a commando dagger of the type devised by Wilkinson's during the war. Finally, in a box covered with danger labels, there was the heavy limpet mine, a flat cone of explosive on a base studded with wide copper bosses, so powerfully magnetized that the mine would stick like a clam to any metal hull. There were a dozen pencil-shaped metal and glass fuses set for 10 minutes to 8 hours, and there was even a box of Benzodrine tablets to give endurance and heightened perception during the operation. Bond went down among the trees and gazed at the waters of the bay, guessing its depth, tracing routes through the reef and estimating the path of the moon, which would be his only point of reckoning on the tortuous journey. At 5 o'clock, Strangeways arrived with news of the secretaire. "They've cleared Port Maria," he said. "They'll be here in 10 minutes at the outside." As they went down to the shore, Strangeways said, "The girl was in her cabin, prostrate with what the captain described as seasickness. There are scores of empty fish tanks on board. Otherwise, nothing suspicious. And they were given a clean bill. How's the gear?" "Perfect," said Bond. "Hope there's a bit of wind. If the air bubbles are spotted, I'll be in trouble." A few minutes after they arrived at the shore, the secretaire appeared. She was a handsome craft, black with a grey superstructure, 70 foot long and built for speed, at least 20 knots, Bond guessed. She turned sharply inside the reef and came down to seaward of the island. When she was below it, she put her helm hard over and came up with the island to port. There was a minimum of backing and filling before she was made fast, just opposite to the watchers ashore, and the two anchors roared down among the rocks and coral. As they watched, the huge figure of Mr. Big appeared on deck. He stepped onto the jetty and started slowly to climb the steep cliff steps. He was followed by two Negro members of the crew, hauling up a light stretcher on which a body was strapped. Through his glasses, Bond could see Solitaire's black hair. He felt a tightening of the heart at her nearness. He prayed the stretcher was only a precaution to prevent Solitaire from being recognized from the shore. Then a chain of 12 men was established up the steps, and the fish tanks were handed up one by one. They counted 120 of them. Some stores went up by the same method. "Not taking much up this time," commented Strangeways when the operation ceased. "Can't be staying long." He'd hardly finished speaking before a fish tank, which their glasses showed was half full of water and sand, was being gingerly passed back to the ship, down the human ladder of hands. Then another and another, at about 5-minute intervals. "My God," said Strangeways, "they're loading her up already. That means they'll be sailing in the morning." Bond watched carefully for a while, and then they walked quietly back through the trees. They sat down in the living room, and while Strangeways mixed himself a whiskey and soda, Bond gazed out of the window and marshalled his thoughts. It was 6 o'clock, and the fireflies were beginning to show in the shadows. The pale primrose moon was already high up in the eastern sky, and the day was dying swiftly at their backs. "A tank every 5 minutes," said Strangeways. "They'll be through about 4 in the morning. Won't sail before 6. Too dangerous to try the passage without plenty of light." "I'll start at 10 sharp," said Bond, "from the rocks to the left of the beach. I'll take fuses for 5 to 8 hours, and the quarter-hour one in reserve in case anything goes wrong."
Exactly at 10 o'clock, a shimmering, black, bat-like figure slipped off the rocks into 10 feet of water and vanished under the sea. Strangeways moved back through the shadows to the house to sleep uneasily and wait fearfully for what the night might bring. Bond was carried straight to the bottom by the weight of the limpet mine that he'd secured to his chest with tapes, and by the leaded belt which he wore round his waist to correct the buoyancy of the compressed air cylinders. Immediately, he streaked across the first 50 yards of open sand. He travelled fast, and in under a minute he came to rest in the shadow of a mass of sprawling coral. He paused and examined his sensations. He was warm in the wetsuit, warmer than he would have been swimming in the sunshine. He watched the telltale bubbles streaming up against the coral in a fountain of silver pearls, and prayed that the small waves were hiding them. In the open he'd been able to see perfectly. The light was soft and milky, but not strong enough to melt the mackerel shadows of the surface waves that checkered the sand. Now, up against the inner reef, there was no reflection from the bottom, and the shadows under the rocks were black and impenetrable. He risked a quick glance with his pencil torch, and immediately the underbelly of the mass of brown tree coral came alive. Anemones with crimson centres waved their velvet tentacles at him. A colony of black sea eggs moved their Toledo steel spines in sudden alarm, and a hairy sea centipede halted in its 100 strides and questioned with its eyeless head. Bond tucked the light back in his belt. Above him, the surface of the sea was a canopy of quicksilver. Ahead, the moonlight glinted down into the deep, crooked valley that sloped down and away on the route he had to follow. He left his sheltering tree of coral and swam slowly forward. Now it was not so easy.
The light was tricky, and the petrified forest of the coral reef was full of cul-de-sacs and tempting but misleading avenues. There were no big fish about, but many lobsters were out of their holes, looking huge and prehistoric in the magnifying lens of the water. Once, the great streamers of a Portuguese man-of-war floated slowly by. He saw several speckled moray eels moving like big yellow and black snakes along patches of sand. Often in the shadows there were unexplained heavy movements and swirls in the water, and the sudden glare of large eyes at once extinguished. The 100 yards of coral took him a quarter of an hour. Now nothing but 150 yards of grey-white water lay in front of him. He still felt perfectly fresh, and the elation and clarity of mind produced by the Benzedrine were still with him, but the gauntlet of hazards through the reef had been a constant fret. Now the forest of razor-blade coral was behind, to be exchanged for shark and barracuda, or perhaps a sudden stick of dynamite dropped into the centre of the little flower of his bubbles on the surface. It was while he was measuring the dangers ahead that the octopus got him round both ankles. He'd been sitting with his feet on the sand, and suddenly they were manacled to the base of the round toadstool of coral on which he was resting. Even as he realized what had happened, a tentacle began to snake up his leg, and another one, purple in the dim light, wandered down his webbed left foot. At once he was on his feet and straining to get away, but there was no inch of yield, and his movements only gave the octopus an opportunity to pull his heels tighter under the overhang of the rock. The strength of the brute was prodigious, and Bond could feel his balance going fast. He snatched his dagger out of his belt and jabbed down between his legs, but the overhang of the rock impeded him. Suddenly he was toppled over, lying on the sand. At once his feet began to be drawn into a wide, lateral cleft under the rock. On the edge of panic he remembered the harpoon gun. It lay on the sand where he'd left it. He reached for it and put up the safety catch. He slid the barrel along his legs and probed each of his feet with the tip of the harpoon to find the gap between them. At once a tentacle seized the steel tip and began tugging. He pulled the trigger blindly. Immediately a great cloud of viscous, stringy ink rolled out of the cleft towards his face. But one leg was free, and then the other, and he whipped them round and under him and seized the haft of the harpoon where it disappeared under the rock. He pulled and strained until, with a rending of flesh, it came away from the black fog that hung over the hole. Panting, he got up and stood away from the rock, the sweat pouring down his face under the mask. Above him, the telltale stream of silver bubbles rose straight to the surface, and he cursed the wounded octopus in its lair. But there was no time to worry further with it, and he reloaded his gun and struck out with the moon over his right shoulder. Now he made good going through the misty grey water, and he concentrated only on keeping his face a few inches above the sand and his head well down to streamline his body. There were barracuda about now, big ones of up to 20 pounds. They glided above him like silver submarines, looking down out of their angry tiger's eyes. They were curious about him and about his bubbles, and they followed him, around and above him, like a pack of silent wolves. By the time he met the first bit of coral that meant he was coming up with the island, there must have been 20 of them moving quietly, watchfully, in and out of the opaque wall that enclosed him. Suddenly there was a long metallic shape hanging in the water above him. Behind it there was a jumble of broken rock leading steeply upwards. It was the keel of the Secateur, and Bond's heart thumped in his chest. He looked at the Rolex on his wrist. It was 3 minutes past 11 o'clock. He selected the 7-hour fuse from the handful he extracted from a zipped side pocket, and inserted it in the fuse pocket of the mine and pushed it home. The rest of the fuses he bedded in the sand, so that if he was captured, the mine would not be betrayed. As he swam upward, carrying the mine between his hands, bottom upwards, he was aware of a commotion in the water behind him. A barracuda flashed by, its jaws half open, almost hitting him, its eyes fixed on something at his back. The mine almost dragged him the last few feet, its huge magnets straining for the metallic kiss with the hull. He had to pull hard against it to prevent the clang of contact. Then it was silently in place,
and with its weight removed he had to swim strongly to counter his new buoyancy and get down again and away from the surface. It was as he turned to swim towards the twin propellers on his way to the shelter of the rocks that he suddenly saw the terrible things that had been going on behind him. The great pack of barracudas seemed to have gone mad. They were whirling and snapping in the water like hysterical dogs. 3 sharks that had joined them were charging through the water with a clumsier frenzy. The water was boiling with the dreadful fish, and he was slammed in the face and buffeted again and again within a few yards. In desperation, he threshed through the water along the ship's keel, the safety catch up on the harpoon gun that was now only a toy in the face of this drove of maddened cannibal fish. He reached the 2 big copper screws and clung to one of them, panting, his eyes distended as he faced the frenzy of the boiling sea around him. He at once saw that the mouths of the hurtling, darting fish were half open, and that they were plunging in and out of a brownish cloud spreading downwards from the surface. Close to him, a barracuda hung for an instant, something brown and glittering in its jaws. It gave a great swallow and then swirled back into the melee. At the same time, he noticed that it was getting darker. He looked up and saw with dawning comprehension that the quicksilver surface of the sea had turned red, a horrible glinting crimson. Threads of the stuff drifted within his reach. Up above, someone was spraying the surface of the sea with blood and offal. Immediately he understood why all these barracuda and shark were lurking around the island, how they were kept frenzied with bloodlust by this nightly banquet, why, against all reason, the 3 men had been washed up half-eaten by the fish. Mr. Big had harnessed the forces of the sea for his protection. It was a typical invention, imaginative, technically foolproof, and very easy to operate. Even as Bond's mind grasped it all, something hit him a terrific blow in the shoulder, and a 20-pound barracuda backed away, black neoprene and flesh hanging from its jaws. Bond felt no pain as he let go of the bronze propeller and threshed wildly for the rocks, only a horrible sickness in the pit of his stomach at the thought of part of himself between those 100 razor-sharp teeth. He was just going to give up and shoot the 20 feet to the surface when he saw a wide fissure in the rocks in front of him. Beside it a great boulder lay on its side, and somehow he got behind it. He turned from the partial shelter it gave just in time to see the same barracuda coming at him again, its upper jaw held at right angles to the lower for its infamous gaping strike. He fired almost blind with the harpoon gun. The rubber thongs whammed down the barrel, and the barbed harpoon caught the big fish in the center of its raised upper jaw, pierced it, and struck with half the shaft and the line still free. The barracuda shot away, zigzagging madly, the gun and line jerked from Bond's hands, streaming behind it. He thanked God for the diversion. His shoulder was now surrounded by a cloud of blood. In a matter of seconds the other fish would catch the scent. He slipped round the boulder with the thought that he would scramble up under the shelter of the jetty, and somehow hide himself above the level of the sea until he'd made a fresh plan. Then he saw the cave that the boulder had hidden. It was really almost a door into the base of the island. He dived straight through the opening and only stopped when several yards separated him from the glimmering entrance. Then he stood upright on the soft sand and switched on his torch. The cave had certainly been fashioned or finished by man. Bond guessed that it had been dug outwards from somewhere in the center of the island. The great boulder at the entrance would have been put in position to seal the seaward exit. He stood there, swaying in the slight current in the tunnel, his head about 12 inches below the surface. And it was then that he heard the drums. The sound boomed and swelled around him in a muffled roar, as if he himself were imprisoned inside a vast kettle-drum. The water seemed to tremble with it. He guessed its double purpose. It was a great fish call used when intruders were about to attract and excite the fish still further, and at the same time it would be a sinister voodoo warning to the people on shore, made doubly effective when the dead body was washed up on the following day. The drums meant that he'd been spotted. Now the enemy was alerted, but would not know who he was, nor that he was still alive. He would have to go on, if only to stop Solitaire at all costs from sailing in the doomed ship. He looked at his watch. It was half an hour after midnight. He moved on into the cave, his torch throwing a tiny pinpoint of light ahead of him. He'd gone about 10 yards when a faint glimmer showed in the water ahead of him. He doused the torch and went cautiously towards it. The sandy floor of the cave started to move upwards, and with every yard the light grew brighter. Then he could make out the end of the cave, and a wide, shining pool beyond it, the white sandy bottom as bright as day. He stopped in the shadow of the entrance, and saw that the surface was only a few inches away, and that lights were shining down into the pool. As he stood, he was horrified to see a thin red cloud of blood spreading beyond the entrance from his shoulder. He'd forgotten the wound, but now it began to throb, and when he moved his arm, the pain shot through it. Even as he drew back a few inches into his hole, his future was settled for him. Above his head there was a single huge splash, and 2 negroes, naked except for the glass masks over their faces, were onto him, long daggers held like lances in their left hands. Before he could reach the knife at his belt, they'd seized both his arms and were hauling him to the surface. Hopelessly, helplessly, Bond let himself be manhandled out of the pool onto the flat sand. He was pulled to his feet, and the zip of his suit was torn open. His helmet and mask were snatched from his head, and his holster from his shoulder, and suddenly he was standing among the debris of his black skin, naked except for his brief swimming trunks. Blood oozed down from the jagged hole in his left shoulder. Bond was almost deafened by the shattering boom and stutter of the drums. The noise was in him and all around him. It seemed enough to wake all Jamaica. Then his guards turned him round, and he was faced with a scene so extraordinary that the sound of the drums receded, and all his consciousness was focused through his eyes. In the foreground, at a green baize card table, littered with papers, in a folding chair, sat Mr. Big, a pen in his hand, looking incuriously at him. He looked polite, but faintly bored. "Good morning, Mr. James Bond," he said. "The fly has indeed been a long time coming to the spider, or perhaps I should say the minnow to the whale. You left a pretty wake of bubbles after the reef." He leant back in his chair and was silent. The drums thudded and boomed. So it was the fight with the octopus that had betrayed him. Bond's mind automatically registered the fact as his eyes moved on past the man at the table. He was in a rock chamber as big as a church. Half the floor was taken up with the clear white pool from which he had come. Then there was the narrow strip of sand on which he was standing, and the rest of the floor was smooth, flat rock, dotted with a few grey stalagmites. Some way behind Mr. Big, steep steps mounted towards a vaulted ceiling. A dozen bright arc lights were fixed high up on the walls, reflecting golden highlights from the naked chests of a group of negroes standing to his left on the stone floor and watching him with cruel grins. Round their feet was a blazing sea of gold coin, yards, piles, cascades of round golden specie, from which the black legs rose as if they'd been halted in the middle of a walk through flame. Beside them were piled row upon row of shallow wooden trays. There were some on the floor partly filled with gold coin, and at the bottom of the steps a single negro had stopped on his way up, and he was holding one of the trays in his hands, and it was full of gold coin, 4 cylindrical rows of it, held out as if for sale. Further to the left, in a corner of the chamber, 2 negroes stood by an iron cauldron suspended over 3 hissing blow lamps, its base glowing red. They held iron skimmers in their hands, and these were splashed with gold halfway up the long handles. Beside them was a towering jumble of gold objects, plate, altar pieces, drinking vessels, crosses, and a stack of gold ingots of various sizes. It was warm and airless in the great rock chamber, And yet Bond shivered as his eyes took in the whole splendid scene, the blazing violet-white lights, the shimmering bronze of the sweating bodies, the bright glare of the gold, the rainbow pool of jewels, and the milk and aquamarine of the pool. He shivered at the beauty of it all, at this fabulous, petrified ballet in the great treasure house of Captain Morgan. His eyes came back to the square of green baize and the great zombie face.
"Stop the drums," said the big man to no one in particular.
One of the negroes took 2 softly clanging steps amongst the gold coin and bent down. There was a portable record player on the floor, and a powerful amplifier leant beside it against the rock wall. There was a click, and the drums stopped. The negro shut the lid of the machine and went back to his place.
"Get on with the work,"
said Mr. Big. And at once all the figures started moving as if a penny had been put in a slot. Bond stood and dripped sweat and blood. The big man put down his pen and got slowly to his feet.
"Bring him up,"
he said, and he walked over to the steps in the rock and started to climb them slowly. They climbed up for about 40 feet and then paused on a wide landing in the rock. There was a door leading off it. It had a new chain and padlock on it. Mr. Big took a key from his pocket and unlocked it. He went through, and Bond and his guard followed. It was a long, narrow passage of a room with rusty shackles low down in the walls at intervals. At the far end, where a hurricane light hung from the stone roof, there was a motionless figure under a blanket on the floor.
"Solitaire," said Mr. Big softly.
Bond's heart leapt. Solitaire was on her feet, coming towards him. When she saw his face, she broke into a run, holding out her hands. "James!" she sobbed. "James!" She almost fell at his feet. Their hands clutched at each other. She was pale and dishevelled. There was a bruise on her forehead and black circles under her eyes. Her face was grimy, and tears had made streaks down the pale skin. She had no makeup. She wore a dirty white linen suit and sandals.
"Tie them up," said the big man. "I have things to say to them."
The negro guard came up and tied Solitaire's arms behind her back. Then he did the same for Bond. They were good knots. There was no play in them. They hurt.
"There,"
said the big man, pointing at one of the shackles. The negro cut Bond's legs from under him with a sudden sweep of his shin. Bond fell on his wounded shoulder. The negro pulled him by the rope up to the shackle, tested it, and put the rope through and then down to Bond's ankles, which he bound securely. Bond was left sitting on the stone floor, his legs straight out in front, his arms hoisted up and secured behind him. Blood dripped down from his freshly opened wound. Only the remains of the Benzedrine in his system kept him from fainting. Solitaire was placed almost opposite him. There was a yard between their feet. When it was done, the big man looked at his watch.
"Go,"
he said to the guard. He closed the iron door behind the man and leant against it. Bond and the girl looked at each other, and the big man gazed down on them both.
"You're the best of those that have been sent against me," he said, "and you've achieved the death of 4 of my assistants. My followers find this incredible. It is fully time that accounts should be squared. The treachery of this girl whom I found in the gutter, and whom I was prepared to put on my right hand, has also brought my infallibility into question. I was wondering how she should die when Providence, or Baron Samedi, as my followers will believe, brought you also to the altar with your head bowed, ready for the axe. So it is convenient that you should die together. That will happen in an appropriate fashion."
He looked at his watch.
"In 2.5 hours' time," he said, "at 6 o'clock. It is unfortunate for you, Mr. Bond, and for this girl that you have encountered the first of the great Negro criminals. I use the vulgar word because it is the one you, as a former policeman, would yourself use. But I prefer to regard myself as one who has the ability and the mental and nervous equipment to make his own laws and act according to them, rather than accept the laws that suit the lowest common denominator of the people. Let me illustrate to you by an example how my mind works. We will take the method I've decided upon by which you are to die. It's a modern variation on the method used in the time of my kind patron, Sir Henry Morgan. In those days, it was known as keel hauling. We have a paravane on board the yacht, which we use for trawling for shark and other big fish. This paravane, as you know, is a large, buoyant, torpedo-shaped device which rides on the end of a cable away from the side of the ship, and which can be used for sustaining the end of a net and drawing it through the water when the ship is in motion. I intend to bind you together to a line streamed from this paravane and to tow you through the sea until you are eaten by sharks." He paused, and his eyes looked from one to the other. Solitaire was gazing wide-eyed at Bond, and Bond was thinking hard, his eyes blank and his mind boring into the future. He was counting hours and minutes, knowing that the big man's own death was creeping, with the acid and the fuse, round the minute hand towards his personal hour of final rendezvous. But would he and Solitaire be dead before that hour struck? There would not be more than minutes, perhaps seconds in it. The big man spoke again. "You will die beyond the reef," he said evenly, "and there will be no evidence. I shall tow the remains of your bodies until there is nothing left. You may know that shark and barracuda play a role in voodooism. They will have their sacrifice, and Baron Samedi will be appeased. That will satisfy my followers." He paused for a moment and looked at them impassively. "I wish also to continue my experiments with carnivorous fish. The paravane will take your bodies over the reef. I believe you will not be harmed inside the reef, but when you've been dragged over it, then I'm afraid you will bleed. And then we will see if my theories are correct." The big man put his hand behind him and pulled the door open. "I will leave you now," he said, "to reflect on the excellence of the method I have invented for your death together. A short but very good night to you both." It was not yet light when their guards came for them. Their leg ropes were cut, and with their arms still pinioned, they were led up the remaining stone stairs to the surface. They stood amongst the sparse trees, and Bond sniffed the cool morning air. He gazed through the trees towards the east, and saw that there the stars were paler, and the horizon luminous with the breaking dawn. He guessed that it was either side of 5:30. He rubbed his shoulder against Solitaire, and she pressed against him. They both knew what had to be done, the nature of the gamble. When the big man had left them, Bond had wasted no time. In a whisper he told the girl of the limpet mine against the side of the ship, timed to explode a few minutes after 6 o'clock, and he'd explained the factors that would decide who would die that morning. First, he gambled on Mr. Big's mania for exactitude and efficiency. The secretary must sail on the dot of 6 o'clock. Then there must be no cloud, or visibility in the half-light of dawn would not be sufficient for the ship to make the passage through the reef, and Mr. Big would postpone the sailing. If Bond and Solitaire were on the jetty alongside the ship, they would then be killed with Mr. Big. Supposing the ship sailed dead on time, how far behind and to one side of her would their bodies be towed? It would have to be on the port side for the paravane to clear the island. Bond guessed the cable to the paravane would be 50 yards, and that they would be towed 20 or 30 yards behind the paravane. If he was right, they would be hauled over the outer reef about 50 yards after the secretary had cleared the passage. She would probably approach the passage at about 3 knots, and then would put on speed to 10 or even 20. At first their bodies would be swept away from the island in a slow arc, twisting and turning at the end of the tow rope. Then the paravane would straighten out, and when the ship had got through the reef they would still be approaching it. The paravane would then cross the reef when the ship was about 40 yards outside it, and they would follow.
Bond shuddered to think of the mauling their bodies would suffer being dragged at any speed over the razor-sharp 10 yards of coral rocks and trees. Once over the reef, they would be just a huge bleeding bait, and it would be only a matter of minutes before the first shark or barracuda was onto them. Now it was getting lighter, and from below the cliff Bond heard the great twin diesels stutter and roar. There was a light flutter of breeze to windward, but to leeward, where the ship lay, the bay was a gunmetal mirror. Mr. Big appeared, a leather briefcase in his hand. He stood for a moment looking round, gaining his breath.
All down? He asked the guards.
Yes, sir, boss,
answered one of them. Take them along, said the big man.
They went to the edge of the cliff and down the steep steps, one guard in front, one behind. Mr. Big followed. The engines of the long, graceful yacht were turning over quietly, the exhaust bubbling glutinously, a thread of blue vapour rising astern. A few yards clear of the ship, the red torpedo-shaped paravane, about 6 foot long, lay quietly on the water, now aquamarine in the early dawn. It was attached to a thick pile of wire cable, coiled up on the deck aft. To Bond there looked to be a good 50 yards of it. The water was crystal clear, and there were no fish about. Mr. Big stood on the jetty and supervised the process of binding them together. Bond stole a glance at the big man's wristwatch. It said 10 minutes to 6. Bond kept silence. There must not be even a minute's delay.
Tie some strips round his shoulder, said Mr. Big. I don't want any blood in the water yet.
Bond's shoulder was roughly bound, and then, under Mr. Big's direction, their hands were freed. Their bodies were pressed together face to face, and their arms held round each other's waists and then bound tightly again. On the jetty there was a pile of rope to the paravane. It hung down off the jetty, and Bond could see it lying along the sand until it rose to meet the belly of the red torpedo. The free end was tied under their armpits and knotted tightly between them in the space between their necks. It was all very carefully done. There was no possible escape. Bond was counting the seconds. He made it 5 minutes to 6. Mr. Big had a last look at them.
Their legs can stay free, he said. They'll make appetizing bait.
He stepped off the jetty onto the deck of the yacht. The 2 guards went aboard. The 2 men on the jetty unhitched their lines and followed. The screws churned up the still water, and with the engines at half speed ahead, the secateurs slid swiftly away from the island. Mr. Big went aft and sat down in the fishing chair. They could see his eyes fixed on them. The secateur cut through the water towards the reef. Bond could see the cable to the paravane snaking over the side. The paravane started to move softly after the ship. Suddenly, it put its nose down, then righted itself and sped away, its rudder pulling out and away from the wake of the ship. The coil of rope beside them leapt into life. "Look out!" said Bond urgently, holding tighter to the girl. Their arms were pulled almost out of their sockets as they were jerked together off the jetty into the sea. For a second they both went under. Then they were on the surface, their joined bodies smashing through the water. Bond gasped for breath among the waves and spray that dashed past his twisted mouth. He could hear the rasping of Solitaire's breath next to his ear. "Breathe! Breathe!" he shouted through the rushing of the water. "Lock your legs against mine!" She heard him, and he felt her knees pressing between his thighs. She had a paroxysm of coughing, then her breath became more even against his ear, and the thumping of her heart eased against his breast. At the same time their speed slackened. They were ploughing along at about 3 knots. He twisted his head above the small bow wave they were throwing up. The secateur was entering the passage through the reef about 80 yards away, he guessed. The paravane was skimming slowly along, almost at right angles to her. Another 30 yards and the red torpedo would be crossing the broken water over the reef. A further 30 yards behind, they were riding slowly across the surface of the bay. 60 yards to go to the reef. They moved slowly along through the water. 5 yards, 10, 15, 20. Only 40 yards to go before they hit the coral. The secateur would be just about through. Bond gathered his breath. It must be past 6 now. What had happened to the blasted mine? He thought a quick, fervent prayer. Suddenly he felt the rope tighten under his arms. "Breathe, Solitaire, breathe!" he shouted as they got under way and the water started to hiss past them. Now they were flying over the sea towards the crouching reef. 30 yards to go, 20, 10... "We're for it," thought Bond. He braced himself to take the crushing, searing pain and edged Solitaire further above him to protect her from the worst of it. Suddenly the breath whistled out of his body, and a giant fist thumped him into Solitaire, so that she rose right out of the sea above him and then fell back. A split second later, lightning flashed across the sky, and there was the thunder of an explosion. They stopped, dead in the water, and Bond felt the weight of the slack rope pulling them under. His legs sank down beneath his stunned body, and water rushed into his mouth. It was this that brought him back to consciousness. His legs pounded under him and brought their mouths to the surface. The girl was a dead weight in his arms. He trod water desperately and looked round him, holding Solitaire's lolling head on his shoulder above the surface. The first thing he saw was the swirling waters of the reef, not 5 yards away. Without its protection, they would both have been crushed by the shockwave of the explosion. He felt the tug and eddy of its currents round his legs. He backed desperately towards it, catching gulps of air when he could. His chest was bursting with the strain, and he saw the sky through a red film. Suddenly, he felt the sharp scrape of coral against the back of his legs. He kicked and felt frantically with his feet for a foothold, flaying the skin off with every movement. He hardly felt the pain. Now his back was being scraped, and his arms. He floundered clumsily, his lungs burning in his chest. Then there was a bed of needles under his feet. He put all his weight on it, leaning back against the strong eddies that tried to dislodge him. His feet held, and there was rock at his back. He leant back, panting, blood streaming up around him in the water, holding the girl's cold, scarcely breathing body against him. For a minute he rested, blessedly, his eyes shut and the blood pounding through his limbs, coughing painfully, waiting for his senses to focus again. Then he looked out to sea. There was no sign of the secretaire. High up in the still sky there was a mushroom of smoke beginning to trail in towards the land. There were things strewn all over the water, and a few heads bobbing up and down, and the whole sea was glinting with the white stomachs of fish, stunned or killed by the explosion. There was a strong smell of explosive in the air. Fountains of bubbles were erupting on the glassy surface of the sea. On the edge of the circle of bobbing heads and dead fish, a few triangular fins were cutting fast through the water. More appeared as Bond watched. Once he saw a great snout come out of the water and smash down on something. The fins threw up spray as they flashed among the tidbits. 2 black arms suddenly stuck up in the air and then disappeared. There were screams. 2 or 3 pairs of arms started to flail the water towards the reef. One man stopped to bang the water in front of him with the flat of his hand. Then his hands disappeared under the surface. He too began to scream, and his body jerked to and fro in the water. But one of the heads was getting nearer, making for the bit of reef where Bond stood, the small waves breaking under his armpits. It was a large head, and a veil of blood streamed down over the face from a wound in the great bald skull. Bond watched it come on. The big man was executing a blundering breaststroke, making enough flurry in the water to attract any fish that wasn't already occupied. Bond could see the teeth showing in a rictus of agony and frenzied endeavour. Blood half veiled the eyes. He could almost hear the great diseased heart thumping under the grey-black skin. The big man came on. His shoulders were naked, his clothes stripped off him by the explosion. A splash of water cleared some blood away from the eyes. They were wide open, staring madly towards Bond. Even as he looked into them, now only 10 yards away, they suddenly shut, and the great face contorted in a grimace of pain. Both arms stopped flailing the water, and the head went under and came up again. A cloud of blood welled up and darkened the sea. 2 6-foot, thin brown shadows backed out of the cloud and then dashed back into it. The body in the water jerked sideways. Half of the big man's left arm came out of the water. It had no hand, no wrist, no wristwatch. But the great turnip head, the drawn-back mouth full of white teeth almost splitting it in half, was still alive. and now it was screaming, a long, gurgling scream that only broke each time a barracuda hit into the dangling body. A fin split the surface a few yards away and stopped. Bond could feel the shark pointing like a dog, the short-sighted pink button eyes trying to pierce the cloud of blood and weigh up the prey. Then it shot in towards the chest, and the screaming head went under as sharply as a fisherman's float. Some bubbles burst on the surface. There was the swirl of a sharp, brown-spotted tail as the huge leopard shark backed out to swallow and attack again. The head floated back to the surface. The mouth was closed. The yellow eyes seemed still to look at Bond. Then the shark's snout came right out of the water, and it drove in towards the head, the lower curved jaw open so that light glinted on the teeth. There was a horrible grunting scrunch and a great swirl of water. Then silence. Bond's eyes went on staring at the brown stain that spread wider and wider across the sea. Then the girl moaned, and he came to his senses. There was a shout from behind him, and he turned his head towards the bay. It was Strangeways, his arms flailing at the paddle of a canoe, and a long way behind him all the other canoes of Shark Bay skimming like water boatmen across the small waves that had started to ripple the surface. The fresh northeast trade winds had started to blow, and the sun was shining down on the blue water and on the soft green flanks of Jamaica. Later that day, towards dusk, Solitaire came out of the bungalow and walked on naked feet across the lawn. She was carrying a tray with a cocktail shaker and 2 glasses. She put it down on a bamboo table beside Bond's chair. "I hope I've made it right," she said. 6-1 sounds terribly strong. I've never had vodka martinis before." Bond looked up at her. She was wearing a pair of his white silk pajamas. They were far too large for her. She looked absurdly childish. The grated blue waters of the bay were quite still. The cliffs of the island were a deep rose in the light of the setting sun behind the house. The girl bent down and kissed him long on the lips, one arm tightly around his neck. Then she turned to the table and poured him out a cocktail. She poured half a glass for herself and sat down on the warm grass and put her head against his knee. He played with her hair with his right hand, and they sat for a while looking out between the trunks of the palm trees at the sea and the light fading on the island. The day had been given over to licking wounds and cleaning up the remains of the mess. A detailed report had gone to M and to Washington, so that the big man's team in Harlem and St. Petersburg could be rounded up. There were no survivors from the Secretaire. Strangeways had a signal from M. It read, "Very well done, stop. Fortnight's passionate leave granted, stop." "I suppose he means compassionate," said Bond. Strangeways looked solemn. "I expect so," he said. "I've made a full report of the damage to you, and to the girl," he added. Said Bond. "M cipherenes don't often pick a wrong group. However—" Strangeways looked carefully out of the window. "Well," said Bond, "we could certainly do with the rest. And this is certainly the place for it. Little house on the beach, miles of golden sands, palm trees, swimming and sunbathing. Nothing to do for a whole fortnight." He looked at Solitaire. There was open sensuality in her eyes as she looked up at him. She smiled innocently.